This is our family's biggest embarrassment, my mother announced, as she introduced me to my sister's fiancé, a Navy SEAL commander. The wealthy guests surrounding us chuckled softly. He reached out to shake my hand, but then he paused. His eyes snapped wide open. He took a sharp step back and delivered a full, rigid salute. "Admiral Kent, ma'am," he said, his voice echoing in the sudden quiet. My entire family froze. Before I dive into how this night changed my life forever, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. If you have ever been the black sheep of your family, only to prove them all wrong, hit the like button and subscribe. My name is Rebecca, and I am 34 years old. For as long as I can remember, my family treated me like a persistent stain on their otherwise flawless social tapestry. My parents, Patricia and Richard, were obsessed with appearances. They lived for country club dinners, designer labels, and bragging rights. My younger sister, Brittany, was their absolute masterpiece. At 31, she was a lifestyle influencer who carefully curated an image of perfection. She was the golden child, the one who never did anything wrong, the one who received every ounce of financial and emotional support my parents had to offer. I chose an entirely different path. I left home at 18, joined the Navy, and never looked back. To my family, my career was nothing more than a low-level government desk job. I never bothered to correct them because their ignorance was my shield against their constant need for control. The tension started the exact moment I walked into the Oak Brook Country Club for Brittany's engagement party. The grand ballroom was draped in white silk and overflowing with expensive imported orchids. Champagne flowed freely, and the room was packed with local politicians, wealthy socialites, and extended relatives who only spoke to me to ask when I was going to find a real career or settle down. I stood near the back of the room, wearing a simple but sharp-tailored suit, sipping sparkling water, and counting the minutes until I could politely slip away. Brittany was holding court in the absolute center of the room, clinging to the arm of her new fiancé, David Lawson. David was 36, tall, sharply dressed in his pristine Navy dress uniform, and carried the unmistakable bearing of a seasoned military man. My mother had been parading him around the room all night, boasting loudly about how her perfect daughter had managed to land a highly decorated SEAL commander. I was checking my watch, silently planning my exit strategy, when Patricia spotted me from across the dance floor. Her eyes lit up with that familiar, predatory gleam she always got, before deciding to make me her punchline. She tapped her champagne glass with a silver spoon. The sharp clinking sound sliced through the soft jazz music playing in the background. The room naturally quieted down as Patricia smiled radiantly, walking over and pulling me by the arm into the dead center of the ballroom, right next to Brittany and David. Everyone's eyes turned toward us. I kept my face entirely neutral, bracing for the inevitable public humiliation I had endured my entire life. Patricia wrapped an arm around my shoulder, holding me in place like an unwanted prop. "I want to introduce you all to my oldest daughter, Rebecca." Patricia announced, her voice dripping with mock affection. "She is our family's biggest embarrassment, but we love her anyway." The wealthy guests surrounding us offered polite, condescending chuckles. Patricia turned to David, placing a manicured hand on his chest. "You will have to excuse her, David. Rebecca fixes government computers for minimum wage. Try not to bore David with your little IT stories, sweetie. He actually saves lives." Brittany giggled softly, leaning her head against David's shoulder and whispering quietly in his ear. I looked at David, preparing to offer a polite nod and slip away to the parking lot. David turned to face me, a polite, accommodating smile on his lips, as he reached out to formally shake my hand. Our eyes met. The smile instantly vanished from his face. The color completely drained from his cheeks. He dropped his champagne flute. The fine crystal shattered loudly against the polished marble floor, splashing expensive wine everywhere. But David did not even flinch. He took a sharp, rigid step back, his posture snapping into absolute perfect military alignment. He raised his right hand and delivered a crisp, unyielding salute. "Admiral Kent, ma'am," he said, his voice booming with absolute respect. "It is an absolute honor." The entire ballroom went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop. The string quartet in the corner faltered and stopped playing completely. Patricia let out a high-pitched, nervous laugh, glancing around at her wealthy friends who were now staring in utter confusion. "David?" She chuckled, waving her hand dismissively at him. "Stop making fun of her. We know she is an underachiever, but you do not need to humor her with fake titles to make her feel important." David dropped his salute, but his posture remained entirely rigid. His eyes blazed with a sudden intense fury as he looked directly at my mother. He turned to face the entire room, his voice echoing off the high ceilings so everyone could hear perfectly. "I am not humoring anyone," he stated firmly. "This woman is Rear Admiral Rebecca Kent. She is a naval cyber warfare prodigy, the youngest person in history to achieve her current rank." The murmurs in the room completely ceased. Patricia's jaw dropped. Richard stepped forward from the crowd, his face turning a deep shade of crimson. "What are you talking about?" Richard demanded, gesturing wildly toward me. "She works at a help desk." David did not back down for a single second. He looked at my parents with absolute unmasked disgust. "She single-handedly saved the national power grid from a coordinated cyber attack 3 years ago." And more importantly, he turned back to me, his voice softening with deep, genuine reverence. "2 years ago, my SEAL team was pinned down during a classified operation. We were completely blind and taking heavy fire. Admiral Kent personally oversaw the intelligence extraction that got my men out alive. I owe this woman my life, and the fact that her own family treats her like trash is the most shameful thing I have ever witnessed." The sheer weight of David's words hit the room like a physical blow. The wealthy socialites began whispering furiously, casting heavily judging glances at Patricia and Richard. Brittany's face contorted from shock into pure rage. Her perfectly curated engagement party was suddenly entirely about the sister she deeply despised. "This is a lie," Brittany shrieked, stomping her foot in her designer heels. She pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "You paid him to do this. You are so jealous of my wedding that you actually paid my fiancé to stage this pathetic stunt just to ruin my night." I maintained my absolute composure, looking at my sister with icy detachment. David stepped away from Brittany, looking as if she had completely lost her mind. "Are you insane?" David asked her, his voice tight with disbelief. "Do you have any idea the level of federal authority your sister actually holds?" Richard aggressively pushed his way to the front, stepping violently between David and Brittany. He pointed a finger inches from my face, completely ignoring the decorated military officer standing right there. "Stop playing dress-up, Rebecca," Richard demanded, his voice trembling with humiliated fury. "Tell these people the truth right now. Stop embarrassing your mother and stop trying to destroy your sister's special day." The sheer audacity of his demand was staggering. Faced with the undeniable truth from a decorated military officer, they had just been bragging about my family, chose to completely reject reality, rather than admit they had been maliciously wrong about me my entire life. They demanded I surrender my dignity to protect their fragile social facade. They expected me to shrink myself down to the pathetic version they invented just to keep the peace. I did not yell. I did not justify my existence to them. I simply looked at Patricia, Richard, and Brittany with profound, absolute indifference. I carefully set my glass of sparkling water down on a nearby silver tray. "It has been an extremely enlightening evening," I said calmly, my voice cutting cleanly through the heavy silence. "David, I am genuinely glad your team made it home safely." I turned my back on my family and began walking toward the grand double doors of the ballroom. Patricia called after me, her voice shrill and desperate, demanding that I come back and fix the mess I had caused, but I did not stop. I walked out into the cool night air, leaving my parents and sister to drown in the chaotic humiliation they had eagerly brought upon themselves. The valet brought my car around to the front entrance. I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, taking a deep, cleansing breath. For the very first time in my life, I felt completely free from their toxic grip. I pulled out of the country club gates and merged onto the dark highway heading toward the city. A few miles down the road, my phone screen lit up brightly on the dashboard console. A new text message flashed across the digital screen. It was from Patricia. I knew instantly that it would not be an apology. My mother was entirely incapable of remorse. I glanced over at the glowing words illuminating the dark car interior. Get back here right now and tell David you lied about your rank. You are ruining your sister's engagement. I left the glowing screen of my phone face down on the passenger seat and drove the rest of the way to my downtown high-rise in absolute silence. The cool night air rushing through the vents was a welcome relief from the suffocating perfume and suffocating expectations that had filled the country club. I pulled into my secure underground garage, badged through the private elevator access, and went straight to sleep. For the first time in years, I did not dream about trying to earn a place at their table. I woke up at dawn, completed a rigorous 5-mile run on my treadmill, dressed in crisp civilian clothes, and headed down to the lobby to grab a coffee before heading to the naval base. I expected a quiet morning. I should have known better. The moment the elevator doors slid open, I heard my mother's shrill voice echoing across the imported marble floor. She was leaning over the mahogany concierge desk, aggressively tapping her designer fingernails against the polished wood, while Richard stood behind her with his arms crossed, trying to intimidate the young attendant. I stepped out of the elevator, my combat boots clicking sharply against the stone. The sound immediately drew their attention. They spun around, and the transformation was instantaneous and sickening. Patricia dropped her aggressive posture and practically sprinted across the lobby, with her arms thrown wide open. Her face was stretched into a massive artificial smile that did not reach her eyes. "Look at our beautiful girl," Patricia practically sang, her voice booming so the passing residents could hear. "We are just so incredibly proud of you, Rebecca. And Admiral, we always knew you were destined for absolute greatness." I stepped back smoothly, allowing her grasping arms to close around empty air. "What are you doing here?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any warmth. Richard stepped forward, chuckling as if we were sharing a private inside joke. He clapped a heavy hand on my shoulder, giving it a firm squeeze. "Now, is that any way to greet your family?" he asked, his tone dripping with fake joviality. "We were just surprised last night, that is all. It is a lot to process, but we had a long talk on the drive home. We realized that having a high-ranking military commander in the family is a tremendous asset. We should be working together." I stared at his hand on my shoulder until he uncomfortably pulled it away. "You bypassed building security to ambush me before work," I stated flatly. "Get to the point. What do you want?" Patricia sighed dramatically, placing a hand over her heart, as if my coldness physically pained her. "We do not want anything, sweetheart. We just want to ask a tiny favor for your brother. You know, Jason has been having a tough time finding his path. He is 28 years old and still finding himself. The poor boy just needs a little push in the right direction." Richard nodded eagerly, taking over the pitch. "Exactly. And now that we know you have all this federal authority and top-tier security clearance, you can easily fix his little legal misunderstanding. That DUI charge is completely ruining his chances at getting a decent job. One phone call from an admiral to the local precinct, and that paperwork simply vanishes. And once his record is clean, you can slide his resume onto the desk of one of those massive defense contractors you work with. A consulting gig would be perfect for him. 6 figures, easy hours. It is the least you can do for your brother." The sheer, unadulterated entitlement radiating from them was staggering. They had spent over a decade acting as though my military service was a humiliating joke. They had mocked my choices, belittled my intelligence, and treated me like a lower-class citizen at every family gathering. Now, less than 12 hours after discovering my actual rank, they were demanding I commit a federal crime to subsidize the lazy, reckless lifestyle of their 28-year-old unemployed son. "I am not going to commit obstruction of justice to erase a drunk driving charge for a grown man," I said, my voice dropping to a hard, commanding tone that caused the concierge to stand up straight behind his desk. "And I am absolutely not going to compromise national security by handing a lucrative defense contract to someone who cannot even wake up before noon." You are out of your minds if you think I will risk my command for Jason. The fake smiles vanished instantly. The sugary sweet facade cracked, revealing the toxic foundation underneath. Patricia's face turned a mottled shade of red. She stepped into my personal space, pointing a shaking finger at my chest. "How dare you speak to us like that?" she hissed, her voice vibrating with genuine rage. "We paid for your entire life. We put food in your mouth, a roof over your head, and clothes on your back. You owe us everything. You only have this fancy military career because we allowed you to go to that free school. You owe this family, Rebecca." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked down at her pointing finger and then directly into her furious eyes. "The Naval Academy is not a free school," I said, my words cutting through the air like shattered glass. "It is a highly competitive military institution, and I earned my placement there on a full merit scholarship. I earned it because I had to. I had to earn it because when I was 17, you and Richard marched into the bank and secretly liquidated my entire college savings account. You drained $60,000 that my grandmother left specifically for my education. And what did you use it for? You used it to buy Brittany a luxury convertible and fund her pathetic beauty pageant entry fees because you thought her modeling career was a better investment than my future." Richard stepped back, his face going completely pale. He glanced nervously at the concierge, who was now openly staring at us. "Keep your voice down," Richard muttered defensively. "We made a financial decision for the household. Brittany needed that car for networking. You were always smart enough to figure something else out. You did not need the money. You stole my future to fund her vanity." I fired back, my voice echoing off the marble walls. "And when I figured something else out and built an entire empire on my own, you spent the next 15 years treating me like garbage because my success did not fit your narrative. You do not get to claim my rank now. You do not get to harvest the fruits of a tree you actively tried to poison. We are done here." I turned to the concierge desk and gave a sharp, decisive nod. The attendant immediately picked up his radio. Within seconds, 2 burly building security guards approached from the rear corridor. Patricia began screaming, thrashing her arms as the guards firmly but politely guided her toward the revolving glass doors. "You ungrateful brat," Patricia shrieked, fighting against the guards' gentle grip. "You are going to regret this. We will make sure everyone knows exactly how you treat your own blood." Richard grabbed his wife by the arm, dragging her out onto the pavement while shooting me a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. I watched the heavy glass doors spin shut, sealing them outside. I took a deep breath, smoothed the lapels of my jacket, and walked out through the private garage exit. I had a division to run, and I refused to let their toxic demands distract me from my duty. The morning at the naval base proceeded with crisp, organized efficiency. I sat in my secure, soundproof office reviewing classified cyber threat assessments and coordinating with my intelligence teams. For a few hours, the chaos of my biological family faded into the background, replaced by the structured, logical world I had built for myself. But the peace was entirely temporary. At precisely 11 o'clock, my secure civilian cell phone began vibrating aggressively against the metal surface of my desk. I ignored the first 3 calls, assuming it was Patricia calling from a blocked number to scream more demands. But then the text messages started pouring in. Dozens of them. Then hundreds. Notifications flooded the screen so fast the device actually froze. Messages from aunts, uncles, cousins, and people I had not spoken to since high school lit up the display with venomous accusations. "How could you do this to her? You're a complete monster. I always knew you were jealous, but this is a new low." I unlocked the phone, my brow furrowing in confusion. I opened a message from my cousin who had attached a direct link to a social media platform. I clicked the link, and the reality of the situation washed over me like a bucket of ice water. Brittany had weaponized her entire digital existence against me. She had posted a highly produced, heavily edited 10-minute video to her 500,000 loyal followers. The thumbnail featured her sitting on the floor of her immaculate walk-in closet, wearing an oversized plain sweatshirt, her makeup expertly smudged to look as though she had been crying for hours. The title of the video was written in bold, tragic letters. My sister is trying to destroy my wedding. I hit play. Brittany stared directly into the camera, letting out a perfectly timed, trembling sob before she even spoke. "Guys, I did not want to make this video," Brittany whispered, wiping a fake tear from her cheek. "But I have to tell you the truth about what happened at my engagement party last night. My older sister Rebecca, she is a narcissistic, military-obsessed bully. She has always been insanely jealous of me. She cannot stand that I found a good man and that I am happy. So last night she hired actors and paid off my fiancé's friends to stage this elaborate, humiliating stunt to make herself look like some kind of high-ranking military hero. She manipulated my entire family. She yelled at my poor parents until my mother cried. And now she is trying to brainwash my fiancé into leaving me just because she is miserable and alone." I watched the view count on the video skyrocket in real time. 50,000 views. 100,000 views. The comment section was a raging inferno of internet strangers calling for my head, demanding my employer fire me, and offering their absolute sympathy to the poor, victimized influencer. Brittany was entirely weaponizing her audience, twisting the undeniable truth of my military rank into a fabricated story of pathological jealousy. She knew exactly what she was doing. By striking first and painting herself as the helpless victim, she was ensuring that any defense I mounted would look like the aggressive rantings of the monster she had described. She was trying to publicly execute my reputation to protect her fragile ego. I closed the application and placed the phone back down on the cold metal desk. I did not cry. I did not panic. The military had trained me to process active threats with absolute calculating logic. Brittany had just launched a coordinated strike against a high-ranking federal officer using a massive public platform to spread malicious defamation. She thought she was playing a petty high school game of social manipulation. She had no idea she had just walked onto a battlefield she was entirely unequipped to survive. The digital onslaught was instantaneous and relentless. My smartphone vibrated so continuously, it nearly vibrated right off my polished kitchen counter. Brittany had always known exactly how to manipulate her audience, but she had outdone herself this time. Her heavily edited video spread like wildfire, not just among her 500,000 followers, but tearing through our hometown and every branch of our extended family tree. Aunts, uncles, and cousins who had not spoken to me in a decade suddenly felt entitled to bombard my personal number with venomous outrage. Aunt Martha sent a lengthy paragraph calling me an absolute disgrace to the family name, accusing me of trying to steal my sister's spotlight out of some deep-seated pathetic jealousy. Uncle Robert left a scathing voicemail, stating that rank did not give me the right to be a monster. The notifications stacked up by the hundreds, a digital mob marching with pitchforks, fueled by the fake tears of a spoiled influencer. I did not block them. I did not respond. I simply silenced the device, placed it in my bag, and drove to the naval base. My world was defined by logic, strategy, and national security. The petty, fabricated drama of my biological family held absolutely no weight inside the walls of my Cyber Operations Command Center. Walking into the high-clearance facility, the heavy steel doors sealing shut behind me, I felt the familiar, comforting hum of massive server mainframes. Here I was not the family scapegoat. I was the architect of digital defense systems that protected millions of lives. I spent the morning directing a team of elite analysts through a complex simulation of foreign network intrusions. My focus was absolute. I compartmentalized the morning lobby ambush and the viral video with military precision, filing them away in a mental drawer labeled irrelevant. But the outside world has a way of breaching even the most secure perimeters. Just after noon, my secure desk line rang. It was the base security checkpoint at the main gate. A visitor was requesting immediate clearance to see me, a Navy SEAL commander who possessed the necessary credentials to bypass standard protocol. I authorized the entry, my curiosity piqued. 10 minutes later, the heavy door to my office opened. David stepped inside. He was not in his dress uniform today, wearing instead his working camos, looking exhausted and profoundly uncomfortable. He stood at attention the moment the door clicked shut, offering a sharp salute, which I waved off immediately. "Take a seat, David," I said, gesturing to the leather chair opposite my desk. "What brings you to my base?" He sat down heavily, burying his face in his hands for a brief moment before looking up at me. His eyes were red, showing the distinct signs of a sleepless night. "I am so sorry, Rebecca. I am so incredibly sorry for the ambush at the country club, and I am disgusted by the video Brittany posted this morning. I tried to make her take it down, but she locked herself in the master bathroom and refused to speak to me." I leaned back in my chair, studying the man my sister intended to marry. "You do not owe me an apology for her behavior, David. You are responsible for your own actions, not hers. I appreciate you defending my rank last night, but you did not have to come all the way down here just to apologize for a viral smear campaign." David shook his head, leaning forward and resting his elbows on his knees. "You do not understand the whole story. I needed to tell you in person, because you need to know exactly what triggered that video. It was not just about the embarrassment at the party. It was about what happened when we got back to her apartment." I remained silent, allowing him to explain. She threw an absolute fit the second the door closed. David continued, his voice tight with lingering disbelief. "She was screaming about how you humiliated her, but then the conversation shifted completely. She realized exactly what your rank meant. She realized how much money you must make, how much power you hold. She stopped crying and looked me dead in the eye and demanded that I force you to pay for our entire destination wedding." I maintained a neutral expression, though the sheer audacity of my sister never ceased to amaze me. "How much was she demanding?" I asked calmly. $200,000, David stated, looking physically sick just saying the number out loud. "She said that because you ruined her engagement party, you owed her a $200,000 check from your Admiral salary to cover the luxury venue in Italy. She told me to use my rank to order you to pay it. She thought because I am a SEAL, I could somehow intimidate you into funding her dream wedding." A dry, humorless laugh escaped my lips. "And when you refused?" "I told her she was completely delusional." David fired back, his anger returning. "I told her I would never disrespect a superior officer, let alone my own family, by demanding extortion money. I defended your honor and told her she needed to issue a public apology for how she and your parents treated you. She went completely nuclear. She told me that if I would not force you to pay, she would destroy your reputation so badly the Navy would have to discharge you. That is when she filmed that fake crying video. She is trying to ruin your career because you will not fund her vanity." The pieces of the puzzle locked together perfectly. The viral video was not just a tantrum. It was a calculated strike designed to apply maximum social pressure. She was attempting to leverage public outrage to bend me to her will. She assumed that, like my parents, I would eventually cave and write a massive check just to make the public embarrassment stop. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention, David," I said, standing up from my desk. "You are a good man. You deserve far better than what this family has to offer." David stood as well, offering a respectful nod. "I do not know what I am going to do about the relationship," he admitted quietly. "But I could not let her blindside you." After David left the base, I retrieved my civilian phone from my bag. The notification count had reached the thousands. The smear campaign was gaining traction, picked up by minor gossip blogs and local news outlets hungry for suburban drama. I drafted a single concise text message and sent it directly to Brittany. "We are meeting at the Espresso Bar on 4th Avenue at 3 o'clock today. Do not bring our parents. Do not bring a camera. If you want to discuss your wedding, you will be there." I did not wait for a reply. I knew she would come. Her massive ego and her belief that her viral video had given her the upper hand would make it impossible for her to resist gloating in person. At 2:45, I walked into the upscale downtown cafe. The rich scent of roasted coffee beans and expensive pastries filled the air. The establishment was crowded with young professionals and wealthy shoppers. I secured a small corner table, ordered a black coffee, and waited. Promptly at 3 o'clock, Brittany walked through the glass doors. She was dressed impeccably in a designer pantsuit, her hair perfectly blown out, wearing large dark sunglasses to shield her eyes from the imaginary paparazzi she believed were always following her. She carried an aura of absolute supreme victory. She spotted me in the corner, removed her sunglasses, and marched over with a smug, self-satisfied smirk plastered across her face. She dropped her oversized designer handbag onto the table and slid into the chair opposite mine. "I am honestly surprised you showed your face in public, Rebecca," Brittany said, her voice carrying a loud, confident pitch designed to draw the attention of the surrounding tables. "Everyone in town knows exactly what you did to me. My followers are absolutely tearing you apart online. It must be so humiliating for you." I took a slow sip of my coffee, placing the cup back on the saucer with deliberate, measured precision. "I do not care about your followers, Brittany. I care about the fact that you attempted to extort $200,000 from me last night. David told me everything." Brittany did not even flinch. The smug smile remained firmly planted on her face. "Oh, David is just being dramatic because he is stressed about the wedding planning," she brushed off casually. "But since you brought it up, yes. I think $200,000 is a very fair settlement for the emotional damage you caused me. You are an admiral. You can afford it. You have been hoarding all this wealth while letting Mom and Dad think you were poor. You owe us." I stared at her, marveling at the sheer depth of her delusion. "I owe you nothing. You are going to take that video down immediately, and you are going to issue a public retraction stating that you lied. If you do not, I will take action to protect myself." Brittany leaned forward, planting her elbows on the small table. Her eyes gleamed with a vicious, triumphant light. She truly believed she had me backed into a corner. She believed the digital mob she had unleashed was a weapon I could not fight. "I am not taking down anything," Brittany whispered, her tone dripping with malice. "In fact, that video is just the beginning. Do you know how much the media loves a scandal about a high-ranking military officer abusing their power to bully innocent civilians? If you do not write me that check by the end of the week, I am going to make sure your commanding officers see exactly what kind of monster you are. I will ruin your clearance. I will ruin your life. You are going to pay for my wedding, Rebecca, or you are going to lose everything." She sat back, crossing her arms, waiting for me to break. She was launching a new devastating wave of extortion right there in the coffee shop, fully convinced that her internet fame made her entirely untouchable. She was waiting for me to panic, to pull out a checkbook and beg for her mercy. She had no idea that Admiral Kent did not negotiate with terrorists, especially those related by blood. Brittany stirred her iced latte with a long plastic straw, the ice clinking loudly against the clear plastic cup. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs and adjusting the collar of her expensive designer blazer. She looked around the crowded upscale cafe, making sure the nearby patrons were watching her. She thrived on having an audience. After securing the attention of a couple sitting at the next table, she leaned across the small wooden table separating us. She lowered her voice into a dramatic, conspiratorial whisper that was still entirely audible to anyone within a 10-foot radius. "You really do not get it, do you, Rebecca?" Brittany said, a sickeningly sweet smile stretching across her face. "You have always been the family scapegoat. For 34 years, Mom and Dad have told everyone we know how difficult you are, how distant you are, and how much you struggle to fit in. They laid the groundwork perfectly. So when I go online and tell 500,000 people that you are a jealous, bitter woman trying to ruin my life, who do you think they are going to believe? A beautiful crying bride whose wedding is falling apart, or the cold, emotionless sister who no one even likes?" I watched her sip her drink, observing her the same way I would observe a hostile malware program attempting to breach a secure firewall. She was entirely predictable, operating on a basic loop of narcissism and entitlement. "You think because you wear a uniform and order people around on a military base that you have power here?" Brittany continued, tapping her manicured fingernails against the table. "But you are completely out of your element. The internet is my domain. I control the narrative. I control what our family thinks. I control what the public thinks. Right now, I have 500,000 people ready to call your commanding officers and demand you be stripped of your rank for abusing your power. Do you honestly think the Navy wants that kind of public relations nightmare? I kept my hands folded neatly on my lap, my posture perfectly straight. What is your objective here, Brittany? David told me everything. He came to the base this morning. He told me about the tantrum in your closet. He told me you demanded he use his rank to extort money from me. Brittany did not look ashamed. Her smile grew wider, her eyes flashing with a predatory gleam. David is just being sentimental. He does not understand how family business works. But since you already know the price, let us cut to the chase and stop wasting my time. She leaned closer, dropping the fake sweetness entirely. Her voice turned hard, calculating, and vicious. You are going to write me a check for $200,000. Today. I have already picked out the luxury villa in Lake Como. I have already contacted the designer for my custom gown. I deserve the perfect wedding, and since you humiliated me and completely ruined my engagement party, you are going to pay for every cent of it. You are an admiral. You have a massive federal salary, premium government benefits, and you have been hoarding all that wealth while letting mom and dad think you fix computers. You owe me this money for lying to us. She took another slow, deliberate sip of her iced latte. And if you refuse, I am going to make a part 2 to my video. I am going to cry harder. I am going to tell my followers that you physically threatened me. I will go to the local news stations. I will go to the national tabloids. I will make you so radioactive that the Department of Defense will have no choice but to discharge you just to make the media circus stop. You can either buy my silence and fund my dream wedding, or you can watch your precious military career burn to the ground. The choice is yours. I did not yell. I did not slam my hands on the table. I did not display a single ounce of the panic or the desperation she was so eagerly waiting to see. I simply stared at her with icy, profound detachment. The absolute silence stretched between us, growing heavier with every passing second. Brittany's smug smile began to falter just slightly as she waited for a reaction that was never going to come. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair, the silence making her anxious. I let her sit in that anxiety for a long time before I finally spoke. You are not a mastermind, Brittany, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the sharp, cold edge of a scalpel. You are a 31-year-old woman throwing a temper tantrum in a coffee shop because your fiancé refused to be your personal attack dog. You think you hold all the power because you know how to manipulate teenagers on the internet. But you do not understand how federal law works. What you are doing right now is not a clever negotiation. It is a documented attempt to extort a high-ranking federal officer. Brittany scoffed loudly, waving her hand to dismiss my words. Oh, please, stop trying to sound like a lawyer. This is family drama. The police do not care about family drama. They care about optics, and right now my optics are flawless. Everyone hates you. Everyone is on my side. I reached into the pocket of my slacks. I bypassed my credit cards and my secure military identification. My fingers found a single crumpled $1 bill. I pulled it out and smoothed it flat against the wooden table. You have spent your entire life believing that throwing a tantrum will get you exactly what you want, because mom and dad always rewarded your bad behavior, I said, maintaining direct eye contact. But I am not mom. I am not dad. I do not negotiate with terrorists, and I certainly do not fund the vanity projects of a grown woman who acts like a toddler. I slid the crumpled $1 bill across the table until it rested next to her expensive iced latte. That is for the coffee, I stated flatly. I stood up from my chair, adjusting the cuffs of my jacket. Have a nice life, Brittany. I turned my back on her and began walking toward the exit. The absolute dismissal was the one thing she could not handle. It shattered her completely. The illusion of control she had built for herself evaporated in an instant. She wanted a screaming match. She wanted me to beg. By walking away, I stripped her of all her power. I was 5 steps away when I heard the sharp scrape of her chair violently pushing back against the floor. A split second later, a freezing wet impact slammed directly into the center of my back. The plastic cup bounced off my shoulder blades and clattered loudly against the floor. Ice cubes scattered across the hardwood, sliding under nearby tables. Brown, sugary liquid soaked through my jacket, dripping down my spine. The entire cafe erupted in a loud collective gasp. Conversation stopped instantly. The barista froze behind the espresso machine, holding a steaming pitcher suspended in midair. Dozens of wealthy customers turned in their seats, staring in absolute paralyzed shock at the chaotic scene unfolding in the center of the room. I stopped walking. I did not turn around. I did not yell. I took a calm, steady breath, feeling the cold liquid soaking through my shirt. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a small tissue, and slowly wiped the few drops of coffee that had splashed onto my hand. I dropped the soiled tissue onto a table, squared my shoulders, and continued walking toward the door, without giving her the reaction she craved. The lack of a reaction pushed Brittany past the point of no return, her face contorted with a deranged, vicious fury. She stood in the middle of the coffee shop, surrounded by staring strangers, and screamed at the top of her lungs. "You think you are so perfect?" She shrieked, her voice echoing wildly off the cafe walls. "You think walking away makes you superior? But I know your secrets, Rebecca. I know exactly what it takes to keep a top-tier security clearance. You need a perfect psychological evaluation. You need to be mentally flawless." As I reached for the heavy handle of the glass door, her final vicious threat rang out behind me. "I am going to call the Department of Defense today. I am going to tell them everything. I am going to show the military just how suicidal and mentally unstable you truly are. You are going to lose your command, and you are going to end up begging me for help." I stepped into the busy street, leaving her screaming into the void. The moment I stepped out of the coffee shop, Brittany was already dialing our mother. I did not need to hear the conversation to know exactly how it would play out. Patricia and Brittany functioned like a highly toxic hive mind. When one felt slighted, the other immediately mobilized for war. They did not waste a single second. That very afternoon, they sat down at the dining room table in my parents' pristine Beacon Hill home and drafted a weaponized document designed to completely obliterate my existence. Utilizing the Department of Defense Continuous Evaluation Reporting System, they submitted a formal, highly detailed, and entirely fabricated security threat report. They weaponized their status as my immediate biological family to bypass standard vetting filters. The report claimed I had a secret, unrecorded history of severe manic depression. They forged narratives of unprovoked physical aggression, citing the coffee shop incident as a violent, unhinged attack where I allegedly assaulted Brittany without cause. They even added completely baseless allegations of severe substance abuse, claiming I was self-medicating to handle the stress of my command. They meticulously checked every single bureaucratic box required to flag a high-ranking military officer as a massive, immediate, and dire national security risk. They had their statements officially notarized by a civilian lawyer friend of my father, giving their coordinated lies a sickening veneer of legitimate legal credibility. They submitted the paperwork directly to the Naval Criminal Investigative Service and the Pentagon Inspector General. They knew exactly what they were doing. They knew that in the world of high-stakes federal cyber operations, a security clearance is a fragile glass house. Even the slightest hint of psychological instability or substance abuse requires immediate catastrophic intervention by military authorities. They did not just want to embarrass me. They wanted to strip away the only thing I had ever truly loved and worked for. The fallout was instantaneous and utterly brutal. 48 hours after the coffee shop encounter, I was standing in the Secure Operations Center at the Naval Base, directing a live simulation for my cyber warfare team. The heavy steel doors to the Central Command Center suddenly opened without warning. Two armed military police officers stepped into the room, followed closely by a senior captain from the Judge Advocate General Corps. The entire operations floor fell dead silent. The captain walked directly to my command console. He did not look angry, but his expression was entirely grim and professional. "Admiral Kent," he said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "You are hereby relieved of your command, pending a formal internal review by the Department of Defense Inspector General. Please step away from the console and surrender your secure identification badge. I stood frozen for a fraction of a second. My team looked at me in absolute shock. I did not argue. I did not ask questions in front of my subordinates. My military training took over completely. I logged out of my secure terminal, unclipped my badge from my uniform collar, and handed it directly to the captain. You are restricted from all classified networks and barred from entering any secure facility until the investigation is concluded, the captain stated plainly. You will be escorted off the base immediately. The humiliation burned hot in my chest as I walked past the men and women I had trained and led. The military police escorted me out of the building across the glaring asphalt of the parking lot and directly to my civilian vehicle. I drove back to my condo in total silence, the sheer weight of my sudden reality crashing down on my shoulders. I had been effectively sidelined from the very institution I loved. Back in the quiet isolation of my secure condo, I received the official notification outlining the charges against me. When I read the sworn notarized statements submitted by my mother and sister, the betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound I had ever experienced. They had painted a picture of a deranged, unstable woman who was a threat to herself and her country. They twisted childhood memories into signs of early psychological decay. They completely fabricated instances of me coming home intoxicated. It was a masterpiece of character assassination. I was pushed into a dark corner where my solitary word was pitted against the heavily coordinated, legally binding lies of my entire immediate family. The military operates on strict protocols regarding security clearances. They do not take chances. If a family member reports erratic behavior, the Department of Defense is obligated to treat the subject as a critical threat until proven otherwise. I spent the next several days confined to my home consulting with my assigned military defense counsel. The lawyer was a sharp, no-nonsense woman who warned me that family disputes were incredibly difficult to navigate in clearance hearings. The review board tends to believe that family members have nothing to gain by lying about these specific issues, she explained. We have to prove malicious intent, and that is a steep hill to climb. The psychological toll of sitting alone in my apartment while my career hung by a single thread was immense. I had sacrificed my youth, my personal life, and my peace of mind to serve my country. Now the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally had weaponized the very system I protected in order to utterly destroy my entire reputation over a simple, ridiculous wedding check. The grueling internal review began at the end of the week. I was summoned to a sterile, windowless briefing room in a civilian federal building downtown to undergo evaluations by military psychologists and interrogations by judge advocate general officers. The process was intentionally designed to break down a suspect. For hours on end, they hammered me with invasive questions about my mental state, my drinking habits, and my relationship with my family. They presented the notarized statements from Patricia and Brittany like holy text, asking me to explain why my own mother would swear under penalty of perjury that I was an unstable alcoholic. I sat straight in my chair, keeping my voice calm and my answers incredibly precise. I meticulously and methodically dismantled their entirely fabricated timeline piece by individual piece. I provided my pristine service record, my flawless medical history, and the results of my mandatory psychological screenings from the past 10 years. But every time I offered a logical defense, the JAG officers circled back to the same impossible question. Why would your family lie about something this serious? I could not simply tell them it was because I refused to pay $200,000 for a destination wedding. Without hard, undeniable proof of their extortion, my claims sounded like the exact kind of paranoid, vindictive rambling a mentally unstable person would invent. The interrogators scribbled notes, their faces giving away absolutely nothing. Day after day, I endured the grueling psychological warfare of the review board. I was forced to defend my entire life, my fundamental sanity, and my hard-earned career against the cruel, vindictive people who supposedly shared my blood and were entirely meant to protect me at all costs. Just as the Judge Advocate General Review Board summoned me for my final deciding interrogation, the landscape of the conflict violently shifted. David Lawson was not a man who missed subtle changes in his environment. As a Navy SEAL commander, his entire career was built on situational awareness and gathering critical intelligence. When he returned to the naval base after our meeting, he immediately noticed my abrupt absence. Rumors spread quickly in the military community. It did not take long for David to hear the whispers echoing through the command corridors that Admiral Kent had been abruptly suspended and stripped of her security clearance pending a massive federal investigation. Knowing my impeccable character and remembering the deranged, vicious threat Brittany had screamed in her closet, David immediately connected the dots. He utilized his own secure contacts within the military justice system to quietly investigate the nature of my suspension. When a trusted colleague in the Inspector General office casually mentioned that the entire investigation was sparked by an urgent notarized tip from my immediate family, David experienced a moment of absolute blinding clarity. He realized the sheer, unadulterated malice of his future in-laws. He realized that the woman he was planning to marry had actually followed through on her threat to commit federal perjury, just to punish me for refusing her extortion demand. The level of sociopathic entitlement required to destroy a decorated officer's life over wedding money sickened him to his absolute core. David knew he could not sit by and let a coordinated family smear campaign end the career of the commander who had saved his team. He began secretly gathering his own undeniable evidence to present to the board, meticulously setting up a massive internal clash that my arrogant, self-absorbed family never saw coming in their wildest dreams. I sat at the center of the rectangular steel table, perfectly composed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the Judge Advocate General Review Room. 3 senior officers stared back at me, their faces completely unreadable masks of institutional authority. They pushed a thick manila folder across the table. It contained the sworn affidavits from Patricia and Brittany. The lead interrogator, a stern-faced captain, read aloud a highly detailed claim from my mother, stating that I had suffered a massive violent psychological breakdown during the week of Thanksgiving 2 years ago. I did not flinch. I reached into my own perfectly organized binder and pulled out my official deployment logs. I slid the stamped classified documentation across the table. As you can clearly see from these authenticated transport records, I said, my voice projecting unwavering certainty, I was not in the United States during the week of Thanksgiving 2 years ago. I was deployed on a secure naval vessel in the South China Sea, overseeing a highly sensitive cyber defense initiative. My commanding officer at the time issued a commendation for my flawless performance during that exact 72-hour window. It is physically and logistically impossible for me to have had a violent breakdown in my mother's Beacon Hill dining room while simultaneously commanding an active operation 6,000 miles away. The officers scrutinized the paperwork, a slight shift in their posture, betraying their sudden realization. The timeline my family had so carefully fabricated was entirely completely incompatible with verifiable military records. They moved to the next allegation. Brittany had claimed I possessed a severe substance abuse problem, stating I frequently drank to the point of volatile blackout. I immediately presented my mandatory random urinalysis and blood screening results from the past decade. Every single test was completely pristine. I am a cyber warfare commander holding a top-secret clearance, I stated flatly. I am tested constantly and without warning. If I had the chemical dependencies my sister describes, the Department of Defense would have flagged me years ago. The evidence is entirely irrefutable. My mother and sister committed perjury. The lead captain leaned back, clasping his hands together. The evidence strongly contradicts the familial reports, Admiral Kent. But we are still left with the question of motive. Why would your immediate biological family intentionally fabricate such incredibly damaging federal documents against a decorated officer? Before I could formulate the carefully worded explanation regarding the wedding extortion, the heavy door to the interrogation room opened with a sharp, decisive click. The military police guard stationed outside did not attempt to stop the man entering. Commander David Lawson stepped into the room in his full dress uniform, the medals on his chest catching the harsh overhead light. He moved with the precise, lethal grace of a Navy SEAL, demanding instant respect from every single person in the room. The three JAG officers immediately sat up straighter. "I request permission to address the review board as a high-ranking character witness for Admiral Kent," David stated, his voice resonating with absolute unyielding authority. The lead captain nodded, granting him the floor. David did not look at me. He kept his gaze locked entirely on the review board. "I have served alongside Admiral Kent in active, highly volatile combat theaters," David began, his words cutting through the sterile air like a knife. "During the extraction of my SEAL team 3 years ago under heavy enemy fire and complete communications blackout, she maintained absolute psychological clarity. She possesses unparalleled leadership under fire. She navigated complex extraction algorithms while the base was actively taking artillery fire, ensuring every single member of my team made it home alive. She is the most stable, calculating, and dependable officer I have ever had the privilege of serving with. To suggest she is mentally unstable is an absolute insult to the uniform she wears and to the country she actively protects." The officers listened intently as David placed a secure digital tablet on the table. "But I am not just here to testify to her character," David continued, his tone turning dangerously cold. "I am here to answer your question regarding motive." He tapped the screen, pulling up a series of time-stamped audio files, text messages, and digital receipts. This is the exact timeline of events that occurred leading up to the Department of Defense Continuous Evaluation Report. 2 days ago, Brittany Lawson, my former fiancé, demanded that Admiral Kent pay $200,000 to fund a luxury destination wedding. When Admiral Kent absolutely refused, Brittany initiated a viral digital smear campaign. When that failed to extort the funds, Brittany and Patricia Lawson coordinated this federal strike. David slid a printed document forward. This is a time-stamped security camera photo from the coffee shop where Brittany issued her final ultimatum. The date and time of this extortion attempt aligned perfectly, down to the very hour, with the digital filing of the false security threat report. This is not a genuine security concern from a worried family. This is a malicious, retaliatory strike designed to extort a high-ranking federal officer because she refused to pay for a wedding venue. The silence in the interrogation room was absolute. The three officers reviewed the text messages David provided, matching the timestamps of Brittany's financial demands against the official Department of Defense filing ledger. The evidence was completely undeniable. The entire narrative constructed by my mother and sister shattered instantly under the weight of hard, irrefutable truth. The lead captain closed the manila folder containing my family's lies and pushed it aside. He looked directly at me, his expression softening into one of profound professional respect. "Admiral Kent, based on the authenticated service records provided and the deeply disturbing evidence of familial extortion presented by Commander Lawson, this review board recognizes these allegations as entirely fabricated and malicious." The captain stood up, followed immediately by the other two officers. "Your top secret security clearance is hereby conditionally reinstated, pending only a standard, routine financial background check to formally close the extortion loop. You are cleared to return to your command. We will be forwarding the evidence of perjury and extortion to the civilian authorities for immediate review." I stood up, offering a sharp salute, which they returned. I had won. I had protected my career, my sanity, and my absolute independence. I turned to look at David, but he was already moving toward the door. His posture was rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle feathered in his cheek. He had successfully defended a fellow officer, but the personal reality of what he had just exposed was tearing him apart. He had just presented undeniable proof that the woman he loved and intended to marry was a sociopathic manipulator willing to commit federal crimes for a wedding venue. Furious at the absolute treasonous behavior of the people he was supposed to marry into, David left the military base with a singular, burning focus. He did not go back to his quarters. He did not change out of his dress uniform. He walked directly to his truck, gripped the steering wheel, and drove straight toward the affluent suburbs. The drive to the family's Beacon Hill home was a blur of righteous white-hot anger. Every red light felt like an eternity as he mentally replayed the absolute depths of Brittany's deception. He had ignored the warning signs for months, brushing off her vanity and entitlement as harmless quirks, but this crossed every conceivable moral boundary. He parked his large truck aggressively against the curb, ignoring the manicured lawn. He marched up the steps and pounded on the mahogany door. Patricia opened the door wearing a pristine cashmere sweater. Her face broke into a wide, artificial smile. "Oh, David, what a wonderful surprise," she sang. "Brittany is in the living room reviewing floral arrangements." David did not smile or offer a greeting. He marched past her without a word, moving with the presence of a man prepared for war. He entered the room to find Brittany sitting on the white sofa. "David, you look handsome," she cooed, standing to greet him. David stopped in the center of the room. He looked at them, his expression radiating absolute disgust. "The wedding is cancelled," David stated, his voice booming. Brittany froze, dropping her arms as Patricia gasped in horror. David pulled out the printed evidence he used to exonerate me. He slammed the papers onto the glass table, shattering their illusion. "I know about the extortion and the fabricated military report," he roared. "I just presented this evidence to the Judge Advocate General Board. You tried to destroy a decorated commander's life over a villa. I will not marry a woman with a malicious soul. I am done with you." David turned on his heel and strode out the front door. Inside, Brittany collapsed onto the floor, screaming in panic, as the truth triggered the absolute collapse of her perfectly curated life. David paused at the threshold, the heavy mahogany door still wide open to the street. The sound of Brittany screaming in pure, unadulterated panic echoed off the high ceilings of the Beacon Hill home, but it did not stir a single ounce of sympathy within his chest. He turned his broad shoulders and marched right back into the center of the living room, his combat boots thudding aggressively against the imported Persian rug. Brittany looked up from the floor, her flawless makeup now completely ruined by genuine terrified tears. She reached a trembling hand out toward him, hoping his return meant he was willing to listen to her excuses. She was entirely wrong. "Take the ring off," David demanded, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous octave that commanded absolute obedience. "You do not get to keep a symbol of my commitment after trying to destroy a decorated officer's life over a wedding check. You are a monster, Brittany. You are a cold, calculating, selfish monster, and I am disgusted that I ever let myself believe you were anything else. Take it off right now." Brittany gasped, clutching her left hand against her chest as if shielding the massive diamond from his sight. "You cannot do this, David," she wailed, her voice cracking under the weight of her collapsing reality. "You cannot just leave me. The invitations are already out. The venue is booked. Everyone is expecting a wedding. What am I supposed to tell my followers? What am I supposed to tell my friends? You are just upset. We can fix this. I can explain everything if you just give me 5 minutes to talk." Patricia suddenly snapped out of her paralyzed shock. She rushed forward, placing herself squarely between her weeping daughter and the furious Navy SEAL. She raised her hands in a placating, entirely artificial gesture, attempting to frantically gaslight the man standing before her. "David, please, you need to calm down and listen to reason." Patricia pleaded, her voice dripping with toxic, manipulative sweetness. "You are not thinking clearly. Rebecca has manipulated you. She is incredibly deeply disturbed, and she knows exactly how to twist a situation to make herself look like the victim. She brainwashed you into believing this ridiculous extortion story. She fabricated those timestamps. You cannot possibly believe the lies of a jealous, mentally unstable woman over the family that loves you." David looked at Patricia with pure revulsion. The sheer audacity of her lies made his stomach physically churn. "Do not ever insult my intelligence again!" David fired back, his voice echoing off the walls. "I saw the official Department of Defense records. I saw the security footage from the coffee shop. I know exactly when you submitted that heavily fabricated federal report, and I know exactly when Brittany demanded $200,000. You committed federal perjury to punish a commanding officer. Both of you belong in a prison cell, not a luxury country club." He stepped around Patricia, towering over Brittany, who was still cowering on the white sofa. "Give me the ring," he repeated, leaving absolutely no room for debate or delay. "I am not asking you again." Trembling violently, Brittany slowly slid the heavy diamond engagement ring off her finger. She held it out to him, letting out a pathetic sob as David snatched the ring from her palm. He dropped the expensive piece of jewelry into his uniform pocket without a second glance. "And just so we are completely clear," David stated, turning his back on them and heading toward the door. "I have already called the venue in Italy. I canceled the entire reservation under my name. I canceled the caterer. I canceled the flights. There is no wedding. There is no destination celebration. There is nothing left for you to salvage. Do not ever contact me again." David walked out the front door, pulling it shut behind him with a resounding slam that shook the picture frames on the walls. He left the family in absolute ruins. The perfect facade they had spent decades building, shattered beyond any hope of repair. Inside the living room, Brittany collapsed completely. She threw herself onto the expensive upholstery, wailing uncontrollably. Her entire digital empire, her carefully curated social standing, and her picture-perfect future had evaporated in a matter of minutes. She pounded her fists against the cushions, screaming about the injustice of it all, completely incapable of accepting that her own malicious actions had caused her downfall. Patricia hovered over her, frantically stroking her hair and whispering empty consolations. The commotion was so loud that it drew Richard out of his soundproof home office. He descended the grand staircase rapidly, his face flushed with confusion and concern. "What is going on down here?" Richard demanded, taking in the sight of his sobbing daughter and his panicked wife. "Where is David? Why is Brittany crying like this?" Patricia looked up at him, her face contorted with a toxic mixture of panic and boiling rage. "He left her, Richard. He canceled the entire wedding and took the ring. He found out about the Department of Defense report. Rebecca must have fed him some twisted, manipulative story. She poisoned him against us. She ruined your daughter's future just to be vindictive." Richard stopped at the bottom of the stairs. His face went entirely pale before flooding with a dark, dangerous crimson. He did not ask for clarification. He did not consider that his daughter might have actually been at fault. In the completely delusional logic of the family dynamic, Rebecca was always the enemy. Rebecca was always the scapegoat to bear the blame for any misfortune that befell the golden child. The realization that my military career was secure while Brittany's perfect wedding was destroyed pushed Richard over the edge of reason. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket, his hands shaking with blind fury. He bypassed his contacts and aggressively dialed my personal secure number. When the call inevitably went to voicemail, he did not hesitate to leave a deranged, threatening message. "You listen to me, you ungrateful, malicious monster," Richard growled into the phone, his voice vibrating with absolute malice. "You think you have won. You think you can manipulate a good man into abandoning your sister just because you are a jealous, pathetic failure. You just cost Brittany her entire future. You destroyed the happiest day of her life over your own selfish, petty ego. But I promise you this, Rebecca, we are not done with you. We are going to ensure you lose your rank. We will find another way to strip you of your clearance. We will make sure you are disgraced, discharged, and left with absolutely nothing. You are going to end up begging on the streets, and when you do, we will walk right past you. You are dead to this family." He ended the call breathing heavily, entirely convinced his verbal assault would strike terror into my heart. Miles away, deep inside the heavily fortified walls of the Naval Base Command Center, I was not terrified. I was sitting at my polished steel desk, bathed in the cool blue glow of my secure tactical monitors. My clearance had been conditionally reinstated only hours ago, and I was working through the backlog of classified cyber threat assessments that had piled up during my temporary suspension. I noticed the blinking notification light on my civilian phone resting on the corner of my desk. I unlocked the device and pressed play on the voicemail. Richard's deranged, screaming voice filled the quiet space of my office. I listened to the entire message without moving a single muscle. My face remained a perfectly blank mask of professional detachment. I did not feel sorrow. I did not feel a sudden urge to cry. I simply felt an overwhelming sense of validation. The voicemail was absolute proof of their instability. It was the final, undeniable piece of evidence I needed to completely sever all emotional ties to my biological relatives. I saved the audio file, backed it up to a secure cloud server, and permanently blocked the numbers of my father, my mother, and my sister. The purge was finally complete. I placed the phone face down on the desk and turned my attention back to the massive global threat matrix displayed on my primary monitor. My world was back in order. The logic and structure of military command had prevailed over the chaotic emotional terrorism of my family. I had weathered the storm, but the universe was not entirely finished with me yet. Before I could type another command into my terminal, the heavy steel door to my office clicked open. I looked up expecting to see one of my junior analysts. Instead, a federal investigator entered holding a thick red stamped folder. He sat down and locked eyes with me. "Your clearance is halted again," he stated. "We have just found a massive, completely unexplained financial anomaly." The federal investigator did not blink as he slid a thick, heavily redacted financial statement across the polished surface of my desk. The fluorescent lights overhead caught the stark red lettering at the top of the page. Defaulted. I stared at the document, my mind struggling to process the string of numbers aligned next to my social security number. $450,000. The figure sat there heavy and accusatory, representing a mountain of debt I had absolutely no knowledge of. "I have never taken out a civilian loan in my entire life," I stated, my voice echoing in the quiet room. "My military salary and benefits have always been more than sufficient, and I own my condominium outright." "There is a massive error here." The investigator leaned forward, his expression remaining entirely neutral. "The documentation suggests otherwise, Admiral Kent. Unexplained debt of this magnitude is a massive red flag in our continuous evaluation system. It makes an officer highly susceptible to blackmail, bribery, and espionage. Until this is fully resolved, your clearance is completely revoked. Your career is officially on the chopping block." I looked from the document back to the investigator, my military training kicking in, suppressing the surge of panic that threatened to overwhelm my senses. "I understand the protocol," I said, maintaining absolute eye contact. "But I also know the efficiency of my own financial management. Someone has fraudulently attached this debt to my identity. I request 24 hours to investigate this anomaly myself before the military takes official, irreversible action against my command." The investigator studied me for a long moment, weighing my flawless operational record against the damning paper trail sitting between us. "You have 24 hours, Admiral. Not a single minute more. If you cannot provide definitive proof of fraud by tomorrow afternoon, the Inspector General will initiate formal court-martial proceedings." He stood up, collected his duplicate files, and walked out of the room without another word. The heavy steel door clicked shut, leaving me entirely alone with a financial bomb that possessed the power to completely obliterate my life. I wasted absolutely no time. The moment the heavy footsteps faded down the corridor, I locked my office door and booted up my secure, isolated diagnostic terminal. I was a cyber warfare commander. I possessed access to the most sophisticated digital forensic tools on the entire planet. I initiated an encrypted covert trace on the defaulted account numbers listed on the federal statement. I bypassed standard banking firewalls, utilizing authorized backdoors to pull the raw, unedited origination data for the loans. I needed to see exactly where and when these fraudulent lines of credit were established. The data began pouring across my screen in dense lines of green code. I leaned in, my eyes tracking the routing numbers and signature timestamps. The initial loan was taken out 7 years ago, quietly expanding through a series of complex, heavily obfuscated refinancing maneuvers. Someone had been meticulously building this debt trap under my name for nearly a decade. I called upon my most trusted forensic accounting contact, a former naval intelligence operative who now ran a private cybersecurity firm in Washington. I sent him the encrypted packet of loan numbers and gave him a single explicit directive. Follow the money. Tear apart every single shell company and routing node attached to these accounts. Within the hour, the first pieces of the puzzle began to snap into place. The loans were not simple unsecured lines of credit. They were commercial property loans. The collateral tied to the $450,000 debt was a specific piece of real estate located in the warehouse district of Boston. I stared at the address flashing on my monitor, a cold, sickening realization washing over me. It was the exact address of the abandoned commercial building my late grandfather had left exclusively to me when I was just a teenager. My grandfather had been the only person in my family who genuinely saw my potential. Before he passed away, he quietly transferred the deed of that warehouse into a holding trust in my name. My parents had been absolutely furious, mocking the building as a worthless, crumbling tetanus factory that would only cost me property taxes. They had convinced me to let my father handle the administrative upkeep while I was away at the Naval Academy, claiming they were doing me a massive favor by managing the worthless real estate. I had trusted them. I had signed a limited power of attorney, allowing Richard to handle the property tax payments and basic municipal filings on my behalf while I was deployed overseas. I never checked on the property again, believing it was just an empty brick shell waiting for a neighborhood revitalization that might never come. I had handed them the exact weapon they needed to completely exploit my identity. The forensic data continued to populate on my screen, outlining a masterclass in familial fraud. Richard had not just paid the property taxes. He had used that limited power of attorney to completely leverage the warehouse. He had artificially inflated the value of the property through fraudulent civilian appraisals, using those inflated numbers to secure massive commercial loans from a series of predatory lending institutions. He had forged my signature on dozens of secondary financial documents, utilizing his status as my father to bypass the standard identity verification protocols. Patricia had acted as the secondary witness on every single notarized document, providing the illusion of absolute legal legitimacy. They had systematically bled the equity out of the building, taking out loan after loan under my Social Security number, and then intentionally letting the account slip into default. They knew my military clearance prohibited me from actively engaging in complex civilian business ventures, relying entirely on my absence to mask their criminal enterprise. The sheer, unadulterated malice of their actions made my blood run cold. They had not just stolen money, they had intentionally constructed a financial time bomb designed to detonate the moment anyone looked too closely at my background. But the most damning evidence was yet to come. My forensic contact successfully penetrated the final layer of shell companies Richard had used to launder the loan payouts. The digital trail did not lead to anonymous offshore accounts. It led directly, cleanly, and undeniably to a joint checking account registered to Richard and Patricia Lawson. I sat back in my chair staring at the undeniable proof of their federal crimes. The $450,000 had been used to fund their lavish lifestyle. It had paid for massive designer renovations, exotic luxury vehicles, and an extravagant high society lifestyle. My family had built their entire Beacon Hill facade on the stolen equity of my inheritance, leaving me holding the bag for their massive defaulted debt. The puzzle was finally complete. The deranged voicemail Richard had left me earlier that day suddenly took on a new, horrifying context. He had promised to ensure I lost my rank and ended up begging on the streets. He was not just making an empty, emotional threat. He knew this financial anomaly existed. He knew the commercial loans were in default, and he knew that pulling the trigger on the fake psychological report would inevitably force a deep federal dive into my background. They had intentionally engineered this entire scenario. The false Department of Defense tip was just the opening salvo. They wanted the investigators to look into my life knowing the defaulted loans would immediately flag me as an absolute security risk. They wanted to destroy me because I had finally stopped playing their game. They wanted to punish me for completely refusing to fund the wedding by detonating the financial landmine they had planted years ago. I printed every single page of the newly recovered forensic data. I meticulously compiled the forged signatures, the fraudulent appraisals, the routing numbers, and the direct deposits into their personal bank accounts. I placed that deranged, threatening voicemail onto a secure, encrypted digital flash drive. I had spent my entire adult life trying to be the honorable, dutiful daughter, absorbing their constant psychological abuse and endless financial demands out of a deeply misguided sense of familial loyalty. But the people who shared my blood had just attempted to permanently end my freedom, my reputation, and my military career. The sorrow and betrayal I should have felt were completely burned away by a cold, calculating, and unforgiving sense of absolute tactical clarity. They had declared war on a Navy commander, assuming I would just quietly, obediently surrender to their relentless manipulation. I gathered the massive stack of undeniable evidence, placed it securely into a locked classified transport binder, and stood up from my desk. I was not going to wait for the 24-hour deadline to expire. I was going directly to the Inspector General right now, and I was going to watch my parents completely burn. The federal investigator did not blink as he slid a thick, heavily redacted financial statement across the polished surface of my desk. The fluorescent lights overhead caught the stark red lettering at the top of the page. Defaulted. I stared at the document, my mind struggling to process the string of numbers aligned next to my Social Security number. $450,000. The figure sat there, heavy and accusatory, representing a mountain of debt I had absolutely no knowledge of. I have never taken out a civilian loan in my entire life, I stated, my voice echoing in the quiet room. My military salary and benefits have always been more than sufficient, and I own my condominium outright. There is a massive error here. The investigator leaned forward, his expression remaining entirely neutral. The documentation suggests otherwise, Admiral Kent. Unexplained debt of this magnitude is a massive red flag in our continuous evaluation system. It makes an officer highly susceptible to blackmail, bribery, and espionage. Until this is fully resolved, your clearance is completely revoked. Your career is officially on the chopping block. I looked from the document back to the investigator, my military training kicking in, suppressing the surge of panic that threatened to overwhelm my senses. I understand the protocol, I said, maintaining absolute eye contact. But I also know the efficiency of my own financial management. Someone has fraudulently attached this debt to my identity. I request 24 hours to investigate this anomaly myself before the military takes official, irreversible action against my command. The investigator studied me for a long moment, weighing my flawless operational record against the damning paper trail sitting between us. You have 24 hours, Admiral, not a single minute more. If you cannot provide definitive proof of fraud by tomorrow afternoon, the Inspector General will initiate formal court-martial proceedings. He stood up, collected his duplicate files, and walked out of the room without another word. The heavy steel door clicked shut, leaving me entirely alone with a financial bomb that possessed the power to completely obliterate my life. I wasted absolutely no time. The moment the heavy footsteps faded down the corridor, I locked my office door and booted up my secure, isolated diagnostic terminal. I was a cyber warfare commander. I possessed access to the most sophisticated digital forensic tools on the entire planet. I initiated an encrypted covert trace on the defaulted account numbers listed on the federal statement. I bypassed standard banking firewalls, utilizing authorized backdoors to pull the raw, unedited origination data for the loans. I needed to see exactly where and when these fraudulent lines of credit were established. The data began pouring across my screen in dense lines of green code. I leaned in my eyes, tracking the routing numbers and signature timestamps. The initial loan was taken out 7 years ago, quietly expanding through a series of complex, heavily obfuscated refinancing maneuvers. Someone had been meticulously building this debt trap under my name for nearly a decade. I called upon my most trusted forensic accounting contact, a former naval intelligence operative who now ran a private cybersecurity firm in Washington. I sent him the encrypted packet of loan numbers and gave him a single explicit directive. Follow the money. Tear apart every single shell company and routing node attached to these accounts. Within the hour, the first pieces of the puzzle began to snap into place. The loans were not simple unsecured lines of credit, they were commercial property loans. The collateral tied to the $450,000 debt was a specific piece of real estate located in the warehouse district of Boston. I stared at the address flashing on my monitor, a cold, sickening realization washing over me. It was the exact address of the abandoned commercial building my late grandfather had left exclusively to me when I was just a teenager. My grandfather had been the only person in my family who genuinely saw my potential. Before he passed away, he quietly transferred the deed of that warehouse into a holding trust in my name. My parents had been absolutely furious, mocking the building as a worthless, crumbling tetanus factory that would only cost me property taxes. They had convinced me to let my father handle the administrative upkeep while I was away at the Naval Academy, claiming they were doing me a massive favor by managing the worthless real estate. I had trusted them. I had signed a limited power of attorney allowing Richard to handle the property tax payments and basic municipal filings on my behalf while I was deployed overseas. I never checked on the property again, believing it was just an empty brick shell waiting for a neighborhood revitalization that might never come. I had handed them the exact weapon they needed to completely exploit my identity. The forensic data continued to populate on my screen, outlining a masterclass in familial fraud. Richard had not just paid the property taxes, he had used that limited power of attorney to completely leverage the warehouse. He had artificially inflated the value of the property through fraudulent civilian appraisals, using those inflated numbers to secure massive commercial loans from a series of predatory lending institutions. He had forged my signature on dozens of secondary financial documents, utilizing his status as my father to bypass the standard identity verification protocols. Patricia had acted as the secondary witness on every single notarized document, providing the illusion of absolute legal legitimacy. They had systematically bled the equity out of the building, taking out loan after loan under my Social Security number, and then intentionally letting the accounts slip into default. They knew my military clearance prohibited me from actively engaging in complex civilian business ventures, relying entirely on my absence to mask their criminal enterprise. The sheer, unadulterated malice of their actions made my blood run cold. They had not just stolen money, they had intentionally constructed a financial time bomb designed to detonate the moment anyone looked too closely at my background. But the most damning evidence was yet to come. My forensic contacts successfully penetrated the final layer of shell companies Richard had used to launder the loan payouts. The digital trail did not lead to anonymous offshore accounts. It led directly, cleanly, and undeniably to a joint checking account registered to Richard and Patricia Lawson. I sat back in my chair, staring at the undeniable proof of their federal crimes. The $450,000 had been used to fund their lavish lifestyle. It had paid for massive designer renovations, exotic luxury vehicles, and an extravagant high society lifestyle. My family had built their entire Beacon Hill facade on the stolen equity of my inheritance, leaving me holding the bag for their massive defaulted debt. The puzzle was finally complete. The deranged voicemail Richard had left me earlier that day suddenly took on a new, horrifying context. He had promised to ensure I lost my rank and ended up begging on the streets. He was not just making an empty emotional threat. He knew this financial anomaly existed. He knew the commercial loans were in default, and he knew that pulling the trigger on the fake psychological report would inevitably force a deep federal dive into my background. They had intentionally engineered this entire scenario. The false Department of Defense tip was just the opening salvo. They wanted the investigators to look into my life, knowing the defaulted loans would immediately flag me as an absolute security risk. They wanted to destroy me because I had finally stopped playing their game. They wanted to punish me for completely refusing to fund the wedding by detonating the financial landmine they had planted years ago. I printed every single page of the newly recovered forensic data. I meticulously compiled the forged signatures, The fraudulent appraisals, the routing numbers, and the direct deposits into their personal bank accounts. I placed that deranged, threatening voicemail onto a secure, encrypted digital flash drive. I had spent my entire adult life trying to be the honorable, dutiful daughter, absorbing their constant psychological abuse and endless financial demands out of a deeply misguided sense of familial loyalty. But the people who shared my blood had just attempted to permanently end my freedom, my reputation, and my military career. The sorrow and betrayal I should have felt were completely burned away by a cold, calculating, and unforgiving sense of absolute tactical clarity. They had declared war on a Navy commander, assuming I would just quietly, obediently surrender to their relentless manipulation. I gathered the massive stack of undeniable evidence, placed it securely into a locked classified transport binder, and stood up from my desk. I was not going to wait for the 24-hour deadline to expire. I was going directly to the Inspector General right now, and I was going to watch my parents completely burn. I did not bother to knock. The heavy oak front door of the Beacon Hill house swung open under the force of my hand, hitting the interior wall with a sharp crack that echoed endlessly through the pristine marble-floored foyer. I marched straight down the hallway, my heavy combat boots digging aggressively into the expensive imported rugs my mother prized. I knew exactly where they would be. It was Sunday afternoon, the time they routinely spent in the formal dining room reviewing their social calendars and managing their fabricated high society image. I rounded the corner and stepped into the room. Richard and Patricia were seated at opposite ends of the incredibly long mahogany table, sipping sparkling water and looking over some glossy floral arrangement brochures. They both looked up, their expressions instantly hardening at the sudden sight of my uniform. I did not say a single word. I walked directly to the center of the table, raised the thick, classified transport binder I had carried from the naval base and slammed it down onto the polished wood. The violent impact rattled their crystal glasses and sent a few brochures fluttering to the floor. I flipped the heavy binder open, revealing the heavily highlighted forensic financial statements, the forged power of attorney, and the undeniable, meticulously documented paper trail of their $500,000 fraud. I expected sudden panic. I expected them to scramble, to weep, to beg for forgiveness, now that they had been caught red-handed, committing massive federal crimes against their own flesh and blood. I was wrong. They did not look guilty. They did not look ashamed. They looked at the documents, then looked up at me with expressions of supreme, unbothered arrogance. "Well," Richard said, picking up his glass and taking a slow, deliberate sip, "I suppose it was only a matter of time before you finally looked into that old tetanus factory." He leaned back in his chair, completely devoid of any remorse. "You always were too smart for your own good, Rebecca." I stared at him, the sheer audacity of his casual tone rendering me speechless. "You stole $450,000 from me," I said, my voice dangerously low and steady. "You forged my signature, leveraged a commercial property my grandfather left exclusively to me, and intentionally defaulted on massive commercial loans under my Social Security number. You committed massive financial fraud." Richard waved a hand dismissively, as if I were complaining about a stolen sweater rather than a coordinated felony. "Do not be so dramatic," he scoffed, rolling his eyes. "You have been living comfortably on the government dime for over a decade. Your housing is paid for. Your meals are paid for. Your entire life is subsidized by the United States Navy. You did not need the equity in that worthless brick building." "We did," Patricia chimed in, leaning forward with an expression of toxic, self-righteous maternal authority. "We are a family, Rebecca," she stated firmly, adjusting her cashmere cardigan. "Families help each other. Families share their resources. Your sister desperately needed the initial capital to launch her lifestyle brand and secure her influencer sponsorships. Jason was drowning in those ridiculous mounting legal fees from his unfortunate driving incidents, and we needed to maintain our standing at the country club. You were out playing soldier in the ocean. You were not using the money. We simply put an idle family asset to good use. It was the practical thing to do. The practical thing to do, I repeated the words tasting like ash in my mouth. You funded Brittany's vanity projects and paid off Jason's criminal behavior by destroying my financial identity. You took out predatory commercial loans and let them default knowing full well that a collapsed credit score could instantly trigger a revocation of my top secret security clearance. You actively risked my entire military career to pay for your country club memberships. I placed my hands on the table, leaning forward until I was directly in my father's line of sight. This is not a family disagreement over shared resources. This is grand larceny. This is wire fraud. This is identity theft. I have every single document right here. I have the routing numbers tracing the loan payouts directly into your joint checking accounts. I have the fraudulent civilian appraisals. I am taking this binder straight to the local police department, and then I am handing a copy to the federal authorities. You are going to face massive felony charges. You are going to lose this expensive house, your pristine reputation, and your freedom. You are going to federal prison. I expected the threat of a prison sentence to finally shatter their arrogant facade. I expected the cold reality of their criminal actions to crash down upon them and force a confession. Instead, Richard actually smiled. It was a cold, calculating, and entirely predatory smile that sent a dark chill straight down my spine. "Go right ahead," Richard sneered, crossing his arms over his chest. "Call the local police, call the federal authorities, call anyone you want. But before you dial that number, you had better think very carefully about how the military handles messy, highly public civilian scandals." He stood up, walking slowly around the edge of the table until he was standing just a few feet away from me. "If you go to the authorities, this becomes a massive, highly publicized legal battle. The media will absolutely love the story of a decorated Navy commander dragging her wealthy, prominent parents through a brutal, protracted fraud trial. The local news will broadcast the fact that you have nearly $500,000 in defaulted commercial debt tied to your Social Security number. Do you honestly think the Department of Defense is going to sit back and watch that circus unfold without taking action? You know exactly how the military operates, Rebecca. They abhor scandal. They absolutely despise public vulnerability. The moment you initiate a messy, highly public civilian lawsuit involving massive defaulted credit, the DoD will instantly and permanently revoke your security clearance. You will be stripped of your command, permanently sidelined, and likely discharged for being a massive public liability. You might send us to a courtroom, but it will guarantee the absolute destruction of your entire career. He stood there radiating supreme confidence, entirely convinced he had me checkmated. He believed that my dedication to the Navy, my absolute devotion to my hard-earned rank, and my clearance would force me to silently swallow this betrayal. He assumed I would protect my military career over prosecuting them for their crimes. Patricia nodded in absolute agreement, a triumphant, sickening glint in her eyes. "We are offering you a simple way out of this terrible mess," she said, her voice dripping with artificial, manipulative sympathy. "We can make the debt completely go away right now. We have a private investor lined up who is willing to buy the warehouse for exactly the amount owed to the banks. It will completely clear the defaulted loans and fix your credit score long before the military officially terminates your command. All you have to do is officially sign the property deed over to us right now. We will handle the sale, clear the books entirely, and you can go back to your pristine military life as if none of this ever happened. Just sign the transfer papers, Rebecca. It is the smartest, most logical move for everyone involved." I stared at the two people sitting directly across from me at the table, absorbing the sheer and absolute magnitude of their profound depravity. These were the people who had supposedly raised me. These were the parents who were entirely meant to protect me, nurture me, and unconditionally support my ambitions. Instead, they had viewed me as nothing more than a convenient, exploitable financial resource. They had intentionally milked my identity dry for over a decade, constructed a massive trap that threatened the only career I ever truly loved, and were now aggressively blackmailing me with the very destruction they had engineered with their own hands. They felt zero remorse. They felt no guilt. They only felt the cold, calculating thrill of securing their own selfish survival at the total expense of my life. The air in the room felt thin as the final agonizing truth settled heavily into my bones. There was no family here. There was no love, no loyalty, and no redemption. I looked at my mother's expectant, arrogant face and my father's smug, victorious posture. I finally realized with absolute uncompromising clarity that there was absolutely nothing left to salvage. They had crossed every single conceivable line, and they completely believed I was entirely trapped bound by the military uniform I proudly wore and the clearance I desperately needed to protect. They had severely underestimated exactly who I was and what I was truly capable of doing to them. Instead of screaming or breaking down, my posture went perfectly rigid. The blinding wave of anger that had threatened to consume me only moments before suddenly crystallized into an absolute chilling calm. I did not throw a tantrum. I did not hurl accusations or shatter the expensive crystal glasses sitting between us. I simply reached out and collected the forged loan documents, tapping the edges against the mahogany table to align the pages perfectly. Richard and Patricia watched me with identical expressions of smug satisfaction, completely misinterpreting my silence as surrender. They genuinely believed their blackmail had worked, assuming the threat to my military clearance had successfully forced me into submission. I slid the documents back into the classified transport binder and secured the heavy metal clasps with a definitive snap. I looked directly at the people who had raised me, meeting their arrogant gazes with a cold, hollow detachment. "You forgot one crucial thing about my rank," I stated, my voice echoing evenly in the quiet dining room. "I do not report to the local police." I turned on my heel and walked straight out the door. I did not look back as I marched down the hallway and exited the house. I could feel their confusion lingering in the air behind me, but their blinding arrogance prevented them from truly understanding the gravity of what I had just said. They still thought they held all the power. They still thought I was the obedient daughter who would quietly sacrifice her own livelihood to protect their social standing. They were fundamentally incapable of comprehending that they had just threatened a federal officer. I climbed into my vehicle, locked the doors, and drove straight back to the heavily fortified naval base. I completely bypassed every single civilian law enforcement agency in the city. A local police precinct would treat this as a messy domestic dispute, a complicated civil matter involving family members and real estate equity. They would drag it through the sluggish civilian court system for years, exactly as Richard had predicted. I was not going to give my family the luxury of a slow, protracted legal battle. I was bringing down the full, unmitigated weight of the United States federal government. Upon arriving at the base, I parked in the restricted command lot and bypassed my standard office entirely. I walked directly to the secure wing housing the Department of Defense Inspector General and the federal prosecutors assigned to naval intelligence oversight. My clearance status was currently under severe review, but my rank still commanded immediate attention. I requested an emergency audience with the lead federal prosecutor, a ruthlessly efficient man named Marcus Vance, who specialized in counterintelligence and military extortion. Within 10 minutes, I was sitting in a soundproof, windowless briefing room, completely devoid of any civilian comforts. I placed the classified transport binder onto the steel table and slid the encrypted digital flash drive across the surface. Prosecutor Vance sat opposite me, flanked by two senior investigators from the Inspector General's office. I did not offer any emotional preambles or familial context. I presented the situation as a direct targeted attack on a military commander. I outlined the entire timeline of the fraud with surgical precision. I detailed how Richard and Patricia had weaponized a limited power of attorney to execute fraudulent commercial real estate appraisals, forge federal loan documents, and deliberately launder $450,000 through a complex network of obfuscated shell companies. I showed them the exact routing numbers, proving the stolen funds were funneled directly into my parents' personal checking accounts to finance their luxury lifestyle. My brother Jason's mounting legal fees, and my sister Brittany's lavish influencer expenses. Then I explained the detonation trigger. I detailed the heavily fabricated psychological report my family had submitted to the Department of Defense to intentionally initiate a security clearance review. Finally, I explained the blackmail attempt that had occurred less than an hour ago. I described how Richard had explicitly threatened to expose the defaulted loans to the media to ensure my clearance was permanently revoked unless I officially signed the property deed over to them to make the debt vanish. Prosecutor Vance listened in absolute terrifying silence as he meticulously reviewed every single document in the binder. His eyes scanned the forged signatures, the falsified tax records, and the damning bank transfers. He plugged the encrypted flash drive into his secure terminal and listened to the deranged, threatening voicemail Richard had left me earlier that day. The atmosphere in the briefing room grew palpably heavy. When Vance finally looked up, his expression was a mask of cold, professional fury. He did not see a family dispute. He saw a direct threat to national security. Admiral Vance said, his voice completely devoid of any warmth. Your parents have made a catastrophic miscalculation. They believe they are playing a civilian game of real estate fraud and financial manipulation. They are entirely incorrect. By using stolen funds to leverage blackmail and actively extort a high-ranking military officer who possesses high-level active security clearance, they have escalated this far beyond a simple civil dispute. The two investigators beside him nodded in grim agreement. Vance leaned forward, lacing his fingers together on the steel table. This is no longer just white-collar crime, he continued, his tone sharp and decisive. This is classified as federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and the direct extortion of a government official. They have actively attempted to compromise a naval cyber warfare commander to cover up their own financial crimes. The penalties for these federal infractions do not involve fines or probation. They carry mandatory consecutive federal prison sentences. We are looking at a minimum of 20 years in a maximum security facility for both of them, and we will seize every single asset they own to satisfy the debt and penalize the fraud. The sheer magnitude of the impending retaliation was staggering, but I felt absolutely no pity. My family had dug their own graves, completely blinded by their insatiable greed and toxic arrogance. They had assumed my silence was guaranteed. The federal prosecutors were livid. The audacity of civilians attempting to manipulate the Department of Defense security clearance protocols to facilitate a real estate heist was an unprecedented insult to the integrity of the military justice system. Vance immediately ordered his team to begin aggressively drafting the necessary federal arrest warrants. They initiated asset freezing protocols targeting Richard and Patricia's primary banking institutions, their investment portfolios, and the Beacon Hill estate itself. The trap was rapidly closing around my family, and they were completely oblivious, likely sitting in their formal dining room, congratulating themselves on successfully neutralizing my resistance. However, Vance raised a single cautious hand, bringing the rapid deployment of the warrants to a sudden halt. He looked at me with a calculating intensity. We have more than enough documentary evidence to secure an indictment today, Vance explained, tapping the heavy binder. The paper trail is flawless, the wire transfers are undeniable, the fraudulent appraisals will easily convict them of the financial crimes. But I do not just want an indictment, Vance continued, his eyes locked onto mine. I want an absolute, airtight, devastating conviction that leaves zero room for plea bargains or reduced sentencing. To guarantee the extortion charges stick permanently, we need one final, undeniable piece of recorded evidence. We have the paper trail of the fraud, and we have the voicemail demonstrating malicious intent. But we need a clean, uncoerced, highly explicit audio recording of your father actively connecting the financial debt to the revocation of your military clearance. We need him recorded in his own words, laying out the exact terms of the blackmail. We need him demanding the property deed in exchange for his silence regarding the defaulted loans. If we capture that specific exchange on a federal wire, they are completely checkmated. There will be no defense strategy capable of saving them from federal prison. Vance leaned back, assessing my reaction. I can send undercover agents, he offered. I shook my head, rejecting his offer without a single second of hesitation. Sending undercover agents into that house would only raise Richard's deeply ingrained paranoia. He was arrogant, but he was not entirely stupid. If a stranger approached him regarding the property or the defaulted loans, he would immediately shut down and contact his expensive civilian lawyers. He would only speak freely, openly, and maliciously to the person he fundamentally believed he had already conquered. He absolutely needed to feel completely in control of the entire narrative. I looked directly at the federal prosecutor, feeling a profound sense of closure wash over my spirit. The time for playing defense against my family was permanently over. It was time to execute a flawless offensive strike. Do not send your agents, I stated clearly, my voice resolute and completely unwavering. Wire me up. I volunteer to set the final trap myself today. Prosecutor Vance stared at me across the steel table, a slow, dark smile breaking through his rigid professional demeanor. He gave a sharp nod to the two senior investigators flanking him, and the sterile briefing room instantly transformed into an active federal listening post. Within 20 minutes, department technicians had routed a secure, deeply encrypted connection directly through my civilian cell phone, mirroring the audio feed straight into their massive recording banks. I sat down in a metal chair in the center of the room, staring at the flashing green light on the console, indicating the federal wire was live. Vance leaned over, sliding a notepad across the table. He reminded me that I needed to sound completely broken. I needed to sound like the overwhelming weight of the military machine was actively crushing me into absolute submission. I took a deep breath, allowing my shoulders to slump, channeling every ounce of the panicked, desperate daughter my family entirely expected me to be. I tapped the screen and dialed Richard's private number. The line rang 3 times before the connection clicked open. Yes, Richard answered, his tone dripping with an insufferable, arrogant superiority. I assume you have had enough time to realize exactly how badly you are beaten. I forced my voice to tremble, injecting breathless panic into my words. You were right, I said, allowing a fabricated sob to catch in the back of my throat. I just spoke with my commanding officer. They are putting me on administrative hold pending the formal security review. If this financial anomaly hits the civilian courts, or if the media gets a hold of the defaults, they are going to permanently strip my clearance and initiate a court-martial. I cannot lose my career over this. I cannot lose everything I have worked for. The silence on the other end of the line was thick with Richard's satisfaction. I could practically hear him gloating. I warned you, Rebecca, he stated coldly. I told you exactly how this system works. You thought you could just abandon your family, hoard your resources, and walk away without consequence. You thought your uniform made you untouchable. Now you understand that we hold the keys to your entire future. If you want to keep playing Admiral, you have to follow our rules. I squeezed my eyes shut, pretending to surrender to his demands. Okay, I whispered, sounding small and utterly defeated. You win. I will do whatever you want. But I cannot just sign over the property deed. It will take weeks to clear the municipal hurdles, and the Inspector General needs proof that the defaulted loans are being resolved immediately. Vance gave me an encouraging nod, silently urging me to bait the hook. I swallowed hard, projecting raw desperation. I have $200,000 in liquid savings. I lied smoothly, referencing the exact amount Brittany had originally demanded for her destination wedding. If I wire you the entire $200,000 today, can you use it to immediately pay down the arrears and get the commercial loans out of default status? If you take the debt out of my name and withdraw the psychological complaint, the military will halt the security review. Will $200,000 buy my career back? I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The sheer magnitude of the cash offer had triggered their ultimate weakness. Blinded by greed, Richard abandoned any remaining caution. He covered the receiver, but the microphones picked up his muffled, frantic whispering to Patricia. "She is offering 200 grand in cash right now," he hissed. Patricia responded instantly, her voice trembling with excitement. "Take it. We can pay off the country club fees and book the new venue for Brittany. Tell her yes." Richard uncovered the receiver, clearing his throat to regain his posture. $200,000 will certainly cover the arrears, he agreed, attempting to sound magnanimous. "But you need to understand the mechanics of this, Rebecca. We leveraged the warehouse using a comprehensive power of attorney. We had to use your pristine military credit score to secure the commercial loans because our own assets were temporarily tied up in other investments. I needed him to explicitly confess to the forgery." I leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table. "But I never signed a power of attorney allowing you to take out massive commercial loans," I protested, sounding bewildered. "I only signed standard tax documents when I left for the Naval Academy." Richard let out a loud, mocking laugh, taking the bait hook, line, and sinker. "You signed exactly what I put in front of you," he gloated, unaware that his words were being permanently recorded onto federal servers. "You were an 18-year-old child rushing off to play soldier. You signed a blank power of attorney and Patricia notarized it. We used your identity to artificially inflate the property appraisals and secure $450,000 in commercial capital. We needed the money to maintain our lifestyle, and you were not using your credit. It was a victimless strategy until you decided to be difficult and refused to fund your sister's wedding. You deliberately took out those loans and let them default under my social security number," I said, ensuring the specific federal charges were clear on the audio file. "And now you are holding my security clearance hostage. You are blackmailing a military officer to extort $200,000. That is exactly what this is, isn't it?" Richard did not hesitate. "Call it whatever you want, Rebecca. Call it a family tax, call it a business arrangement, or call it blackmail. The reality is that if you do not pay us the $200,000 by the end of the week, I will personally hand your defaulted financial portfolio to the local press. I will make sure the Department of Defense terminates your command in utter disgrace. You will wire the funds directly into our joint account. Let me give you the routing number right now." Vance rapidly signaled to a nearby agent who began transcribing the banking details as Richard read them aloud. He provided the exact routing and account numbers for the joint checking account they had used to launder the original loan payouts, tying himself to the financial crimes with his own words. As Richard finished reciting the numbers, another voice suddenly cut into the line. Brittany had clearly been listening on the extension, unable to resist the opportunity to gloat over my apparent destruction. "Well, well, well," Brittany mocked, her voice dripping with toxic, triumphant venom. "Look who finally decided to learn her place in the family hierarchy. You really thought you were better than us just because you wear a fancy uniform and have a government title. You thought you could ruin my perfect Italian wedding and just walk away. Now you are begging us to save your pathetic career. You should be thanking us for letting you pay your way out of this mess. I hope writing that massive check hurts, Rebecca. I hope it reminds you that you will always be beneath us." I let her finish her deranged tirade, maintaining my facade of absolute defeat. "I understand," I said quietly. "I will initiate the transfer protocols immediately. Since the banks require 48 hours to clear a wire transfer of this magnitude, I will finalize the withdrawal paperwork and bring you the certified cashier's check in person at the upcoming Thanksgiving dinner. It will prove my loyalty to the family." Richard let out a satisfied grunt, fooled by my apparent total submission. "See," Patricia chimed in from the background, her voice echoing with delusional triumph. "I always knew you would eventually come around and remember the importance of family. Bring the check to the Thanksgiving dinner, Rebecca. We can finally put this unfortunate misunderstanding behind us and celebrate properly." "I will be there," I promised, my voice dropping to a dark, ominous whisper that they entirely mistook for shame. I ended the call and placed the phone face down on the steel table. For a moment, the briefing room was completely silent. Then Prosecutor Vance let out a low, deeply impressed whistle. The two senior investigators grinned at each other, vibrating with intense professional satisfaction. The trap had snapped shut with absolute devastating perfection. My parents had just handed the federal government a pristine, fully recorded confession to multiple severe felonies, explicitly tying their wire fraud and identity theft directly to the active blackmail of a high-ranking military officer. The federal agents listening in the room had obtained absolutely everything they needed to obliterate my family. Warrants were officially signed by a federal judge that very afternoon. My family thought they had successfully manipulated me into attending a festive holiday dinner to hand over an extortion payment, but they were actually preparing to host their own total unmitigated annihilation. The Beacon Hill estate was a masterclass in aggressive, unapologetic extravagance. For their annual Thanksgiving dinner, Richard and Patricia had completely outdone themselves, transforming the already massive property into a glittering fortress of high society indulgence. Over 50 guests occupied the grand ballroom, which had been seamlessly converted into an opulent dining space. The guest list was a meticulously curated roster of local politicians, wealthy real estate developers, and elite country club socialites, all gathered to feast on catered delicacies and bask in the manufactured glow of the Lawson family legacy. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden light over the imported silk table runners and the towering cascading floral centerpieces. Waitstaff in crisp black uniforms circulated silently through the crowd, balancing silver trays loaded with vintage champagne and gourmet appetizers. At the center of the room, Brittany was holding court, dressed in a custom designer gown that screamed inherited wealth. She was completely surrounded by a gaggle of sympathetic, wealthy heiresses, eagerly lapping up the attention. She took a delicate sip from her crystal flute and let out a perfectly rehearsed, entirely fabricated sigh of brave resignation. "It is just so incredibly difficult," Brittany told the group, her voice projecting just enough to ensure the nearby tables could hear her tragic tale. "David and I were so close to finalizing the destination wedding in Italy. Everything was absolutely perfect. But you know how the military is. They do not care about personal lives." He was suddenly called away on a highly classified deep-cover deployment. It was completely unexpected, and he was absolutely devastated to leave me behind. But I have to be the strong military partner he needs right now. The women around her cooed in absolute sympathy, offering words of encouragement and praising her remarkable resilience. Across the massive ballroom, Patricia was engaged in her own highly orchestrated theatrical performance. She stood near the roaring marble fireplace wearing a flawlessly tailored emerald evening dress and a heavy string of pearls. A circle of prominent local politicians and influential business leaders hung on her every word. Patricia dabbed at the corners of her dry eyes with a monogrammed linen handkerchief, playing the role of the heartbroken, long-suffering mother to absolute perfection. "It has been a season of terrible, unimaginable trials for our family," Patricia murmured, her voice dripping with artificial sorrow. Several guests nodded solemnly, their faces etched with polite concern. "I am sure you have all noticed that my eldest daughter Rebecca is not with us to celebrate the holiday today. We tried to keep it a private family matter, but the rumors are simply becoming too much to bear." The truth is, the pressure of her military career finally broke her. She suffered a severe, catastrophic mental breakdown last week. We had to make the agonizing decision to place her in a secure private psychiatric facility upstate for her own safety. She has completely lost her grip on reality, making up wild, paranoid delusions about the family. It is a tragedy to watch a bright mind deteriorate so rapidly, but Richard and I are entirely committed to funding her long-term psychological recovery. The guests murmured in profound pity, completely buying into the pristine, tragic narrative Patricia had so effortlessly spun. They praised her unconditional maternal devotion, completely oblivious to the fact that they were applauding a woman who was actively plotting to destroy her own daughter. The entire room was an echo chamber of validation for their absolute, unmitigated narcissism. Just as Patricia raised her glass to accept a toast to her fabricated maternal strength, a deafening, resounding crash shattered the elegant ambiance of the evening. The massive, solid oak front doors of the grand foyer were pushed wide open with such extreme violent force that the heavy brass handles slammed into the interior drywall. The heavy thud echoed like a gunshot over the gentle hum of classical music and polite conversation. The clinking of crystal glasses stopped instantly. The soft ambient music seemed to evaporate into the sudden suffocating vacuum of air. Every single head in the grand ballroom snapped toward the arched entranceway. The room fell completely terrifyingly dead silent as the guests stared in absolute unadulterated shock at the woman they had just been told was currently locked inside a secure psychiatric asylum. I stepped into the archway, my posture perfectly rigid, my chin held high. I was not wearing civilian clothes, and I was certainly not wearing the drab uniform of a defeated, broken mental patient. I was wearing my crisp, pristine navy dress whites. The bright white fabric stood out in sharp, aggressive contrast against the warm, golden hues of the dining room. My chest was heavily covered in the colorful ribbons, commendations, and tactical medals I had earned through over a decade of flawless, dedicated service to my country. Every brass button was polished to a blinding shine. Every crease was razor sharp. I looked exactly like what I was, a high-ranking military commander walking onto a hostile battlefield. But the collective shock of the wealthy guests did not stem solely from my sudden, unexpected appearance or my pristine military uniform. It stemmed from the absolute, undeniable force of federal authority that flanked my every single step. I was not walking into this confrontation alone. Directly to my right and left marched two stone-faced judge advocate general attorneys, their dark, immaculate suits contrasting sharply with my white uniform. They carried heavy locked leather briefcases, containing the federal warrants, the wiretap transcripts, and the mountain of forensic financial data we had gathered. But they were merely the legal vanguard. Immediately behind them, spreading out in a highly coordinated tactical formation to completely secure the perimeter of the grand foyer, were four heavily armed federal agents. They wore dark tactical gear, but it was the bold, bright yellow lettering stamped across the back of their reinforced raid jackets that commanded absolute terror. Department of Defense, Inspector General. The heavy synchronized thud of our boots against the marble floor sounded like the beating of a war drum as we advanced into the room. The absolute silence of the ballroom was deafening. 50 influential guests, politicians and socialites, stood frozen like statues, their wine glasses hovering halfway to their mouths, completely incapable of processing the surreal, highly aggressive raid unfolding before their very eyes. The beautiful, delicate illusion my parents had spent years meticulously crafting was instantly and violently ripped away, replaced by the harsh, uncompromising reality of federal law enforcement. I locked eyes with Patricia. The monogrammed linen handkerchief she had been using to fake her maternal tears slipped from her trembling fingers and fluttered silently to the hardwood floor. The arrogant, triumphant glow that had illuminated her face just seconds prior completely vanished instantly, replaced by a stark, sickening pallor of absolute dread. She took a stumbling step backward, bumping into the roaring marble fireplace, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. Across the room, Brittany dropped her crystal champagne flute. It shattered against the floor, sending wine splashing across the shoes of her friends. But nobody flinched. Brittany stared at the federal agents in uncomprehending panic, her rehearsed tale of military deployment dissolving into sheer terror. Richard sat at the head of the massive dining table, a carving knife frozen in his right hand. He stared at the DoD Inspector General seals on the jackets of the armed agents, the blood draining from his face, as he desperately tried to calculate an escape route that simply did not exist. He had expected a broken daughter to arrive quietly with a $200,000 extortion check. Instead, he was facing a heavily armed federal strike team and a completely unyielding Navy commander. The sheer gravity of his horrific situation crashed down upon his shoulders, destroying his delusional sense of invulnerability. He was paralyzed by the inescapable weight of federal law enforcement bearing down upon his home. I did not break my stride. I marched through the parted sea of terrified silent guests, the two JAG attorneys, and 4 federal agents matching my pace perfectly, The guests scrambled backward, pulling their chairs out of the way, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive epicenter of the impending destruction. I stopped directly at the head of the dining table, looming over my father. He looked incredibly small, stripped of his unearned arrogance and his predatory confidence. I reached into my uniform pocket, my movements slow, deliberate, and completely inescapable. I didn't pull out a cashier's check. I pulled out a small, encrypted digital recording device provided by the federal prosecutors. I placed it onto the center of the table right next to his pristine porcelain dinner plate. "I promised I would bring you exactly what you earned," I stated, my voice ringing out with crystal clear, unwavering authority across the dead silent room. "Happy Thanksgiving, Richard." The small black recording device sat on the pristine porcelain plate, looking like a bomb waiting to detonate. The silence in the grand ballroom stretched out heavy and suffocating, broken only by the crackle of the massive marble fireplace. 50 of the most influential socialites, politicians, and real estate developers in the city stared at me in a state of absolute, unblinking paralysis. I turned my back on my father and faced the sea of wide-eyed guests, my posture perfectly rigid, the gold buttons of my navy dress whites gleaming under the crystal chandeliers. "I apologize for interrupting the evening festivities," I announced, my voice carrying clear and steady across the massive room. "But since my mother was just graciously informing all of you about my current health and whereabouts, I felt it was only appropriate to provide a direct update." I let my gaze sweep over the crowd, locking eyes with the local politicians who had just been offering Patricia their fake sympathy. "I am not currently locked in a secure psychiatric facility. I have not suffered a mental breakdown. I am an active duty commander in the United States Navy, and I have just been fully cleared and commended by the Department of Defense." A collective gasp rippled through the room. The wealthy heiresses who had been fawning over Brittany just moments ago took several synchronized steps backward, their expensive silk gowns rustling as they desperately tried to distance themselves from our family. I looked back at Patricia. The sheer, unadulterated terror radiating from her face was absolute. Her carefully constructed high society persona was rapidly melting away, leaving behind the hollow, panicked shell of a woman who had finally been caught. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I turned toward the stone-faced JAG attorneys and the heavily armed federal agents standing rigidly at my flanks. "Execute the warrants," I commanded. The lead federal agent stepped forward, unzipping the heavy tactical jacket stamped with the DoD Inspector General's seal. The two JAG attorneys simultaneously unclasped their leather briefcases, producing thick stacks of watermarked federal documents. Richard Lawson and Patricia Lawson, the lead agent, barked, his voice booming with unmistakable law enforcement authority. "You are hereby served with federal arrest warrants issued by the United States District Court." The agent did not lower his voice to spare them any humiliation. He projected every single word, ensuring that every politician, every country club friend, and every extended family member heard the absolute truth of the Lawson family legacy. "You are being charged with multiple counts of federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and the direct premeditated extortion of a United States military official." The agent continued, stepping closer to the head of the mahogany table. The ballroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of shocked murmurs and horrified whispers. The agent raised the warrant, reading the charges aloud for the entire room to digest. "These charges stem from the fraudulent execution of a forged power of attorney, which was utilized to secure massive commercial real estate loans. You stand accused of stealing $450,000 in federal funds, intentionally defaulting on those loans under a stolen identity, and actively attempting to blackmail a commissioned naval officer into silence." Brittany let out a piercing, hysterical shriek that echoed violently off the high vaulted ceilings. She stumbled backward, her hands flying to her face, her custom designer gown suddenly looking ridiculous against the backdrop of a federal raid. Her entire social empire was actively burning to the ground right in front of her most important peers. The heiresses she had been holding court with were already pulling out their cell phones, their thumbs flying across the screens as they aggressively texted the scandalous details to every country club in the tri-state area. My life is over, Brittany screamed, her voice cracking as she looked around the room at the disgusted faces of her friends. My entire life is completely ruined. Everything is gone. The guests were not looking at her with pity anymore. They were looking at her with absolute, unfiltered revulsion. The lie about her fiancé David being called away on a highly classified deployment was instantly exposed for the pathetic, desperate fabrication it was. Everyone in the room suddenly realized they were standing inside a house built entirely on fraud, theft, and deception. The prominent real estate developers and local politicians began edging toward the grand foyer, abandoning their half-empty champagne flutes on the catering trays, terrified that their mere presence at this table would somehow implicate them in a federal extortion ring. Richard remained frozen in his chair at the head of the table, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. I could see the gears turning violently in his mind. He was a cornered animal backed against a wall by a force he could not manipulate, bribe, or intimidate. His eyes darted from the federal agents to the exit and then toward the mahogany doors leading to his private study. He suddenly remembered the unencrypted hard drive sitting on his desk, the servers that held every single digital footprint of his fraudulent shell companies, the forged civilian appraisals, and the offshore accounts he used to launder my stolen equity. Survival instinct violently overrode his paralysis. Richard shoved his heavy wooden dining chair backward with explosive force. The chair slammed into a passing waiter, sending a silver tray of appetizers crashing onto the imported rugs. Richard lunged toward the hallway, his expensive loafers slipping wildly on the polished hardwood floors as he made a desperate, pathetic sprint toward his home office. He did not make it past the threshold. The federal agents reacted with terrifying, synchronized speed before Richard could even reach out to grasp the brass handle of the study door. The lead agent intercepted him. A heavy tactical takedown sent Richard flying through the air. He slammed face first into the floor with a sickening thud, his expensive suit tearing against the friction of the rug. Two agents dropped their weight onto his back, pinning him firmly against the ground. "Do not move a single muscle," the agent roared, driving his knee sharply between Richard's shoulder blades. "Keep your hands where I can see them." The supreme, unbothered arrogance that my father had displayed just hours earlier when he sat sipping sparkling water and threatening to destroy my entire military career was entirely gone. He was groveling in the dirt, his face pressed painfully against the floorboards, gasping for air under the crushing weight of federal law enforcement. The grand patriarch of the Lawson family, the man who believed he was an untouchable king, had been reduced to a common struggling criminal in front of 50 of his most respected peers. The sharp, metallic ratcheting of heavy steel handcuffs echoed through the dining room. It was the definitive, uncompromising sound of absolute finality. An agent yanked Richard's arms roughly behind his back and secured the steel cuffs around his wrists, locking them tight. At the exact same moment, another agent stepped behind Patricia, grabbing her wrists and pulling them behind her back to secure a second pair of handcuffs. The facade was completely and entirely obliterated. Panic and humiliation consumed them both. The reality of their 20-year mandatory minimum sentences finally crashed down upon their heads. Patricia's knees buckled completely. She collapsed toward the floor, her heavy string of pearls swinging wildly against her chest. The federal agent holding her handcuffs struggled to keep her upright as she dropped her dead weight onto the imported rug. The elegant emerald evening gown she wore pooled around her knees like a crumpled parachute. She began weeping hysterically, the mascara running down her cheeks in thick, dark streams, completely destroying her flawless makeup. She looked up at me, her eyes wild, desperate, and filled with a sudden, agonizing terror. She was no longer the toxic, self-righteous maternal authority who had coldly justified stealing $500,000 to fund country club memberships. She was a terrified, trapped felon begging for her life. "Rebecca, please." Patricia wailed, her voice echoing with a pathetic, grating desperation. She strained against the grip of the federal agent trying to crawl across the floor toward my pristine white uniform. "You have to stop them. Tell them it was just a misunderstanding. Tell them we can pay it all back. We are your parents. You cannot do this to your own family. You cannot do this to blood. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the woman weeping at my combat boots. I did not flinch. I did not feel a single drop of remorse, guilt, or familial obligation. They had eagerly planned to strip me of my command, destroy my reputation, and burn my entire future to the ground, just to protect their fraudulent wealth. They had laughed in my face when I confronted them with their own crimes. They had gleefully blackmailed me, assuming my silence was the price of my uniform. I stared directly into Patricia's tear-streaked, terrified face. You forfeited the right to call yourselves my family the moment you forged my name on those federal documents. I said, my voice cutting through her hysterical sobbing like a blade of solid ice. You chose to be criminals. I am simply bringing you to justice. I turned my head and gave a sharp, definitive nod to the lead federal agent. The agent yanked Patricia roughly to her feet by her handcuffed arms, ignoring her desperate pleading screams. Take them both out of my sight. I commanded, my voice ringing with the absolute authority of a naval officer who had just successfully executed the total annihilation of a hostile threat. Get them out of this house. The agents grabbed Richard and Patricia by their arms and began marching them toward the grand foyer. The 50 elite guests parted immediately, scrambling out of the way to create a wide, clear path for the criminals. No one offered a single word of support. No one stepped forward to defend them. The influential politicians and wealthy real estate developers simply watched in stunned, horrified silence as the disgraced king and queen of Beacon Hill were paraded out of their own opulent mansion in heavy steel chains. Brittany remained collapsed in the corner of the dining room, hyperventilating into her hands, completely abandoned by her high society friends who were now actively fleeing out the back doors to escape the presence of federal investigators. The caterers stood frozen against the walls, completely unsure of what to do with the massive, untouched Thanksgiving feast sitting on the mahogany table. I remained standing in the center of the devastated ballroom, surrounded by the shattered remains of my parents' fraudulent empire. The suffocating weight of their emotional manipulation, the decades of toxic financial abuse, and the constant draining pressure of their narcissistic demands were finally and permanently gone. I adjusted the collar of my navy dress whites, feeling the heavy, undeniable weight of the medals pinned to my chest. I had not just survived their attack, I had completely neutralized the enemy, secured my command, and reclaimed absolute ownership of my own life. I took a deep, steadying breath, the air in the room suddenly feeling incredibly clean, crisp, and wonderfully free. I turned on my heel, leaving the destruction of the Lawson family behind me, and walked out the front doors into the cool, refreshing air of the holiday evening. My federal clearance was safe, my future was entirely my own, and my revenge was absolutely perfect. The ultimate betrayal had finally ended. I looked down at the pathetic woman weeping hysterically at my combat boots, feeling an absolute, profound, and icy emptiness where a loving daughter's devotion was originally supposed to reside. Patricia clutched at the hem of my trousers, her manicured fingers smearing her own tears into the pristine white fabric of my uniform. She sobbed loudly with a frantic, unhinged, animalistic desperation, pathetically begging for a merciful reprieve she had completely denied me when she willfully signed her own name to forge my federal identity. I felt absolutely zero emotion. I did not flinch or blink as her heavy, expensive pearls harshly scraped against the polished hardwood floor. I did not yell, scream, or offer a single syllable of comfort. I simply stood there, a tall, towering pillar of unshakable naval authority, silently observing her complete and utter destruction with the extreme clinical detachment of a commanding officer, thoroughly analyzing a permanently neutralized threat. I looked into her wild, terrified eyes, offering absolutely no forgiveness. You lost the right to call yourselves my blood the day you sold my future to fund her vanity, I stated, my voice echoing with a cold, unrelenting finality across the devastated ballroom. Admiral Kent is leaving. You can deal with the feds. I turned my back on my screaming family, my heavy boots striking the floor with a rhythmic, measured cadence. I walked straight through the parted sea of horrified politicians and utterly speechless high society guests. I marched out the heavy oak front doors and stepped into the crisp, biting autumn air. Just as the sharp metallic click of federal handcuffs echoed through the grand foyer behind me. 6. Agonizing, highly publicized, incredibly humiliating months later, the absolute, undeniable ruin of the corrupt Lawson family was a matter of permanent, accessible public record. The federal justice system operated with a ruthless, uncompromising efficiency that completely dismantled their pristine suburban empire. Richard and Patricia did not receive the polite, gentle treatment they had always anticipated from local law enforcement. There were no country club lawyers capable of saving them from the devastating audio recordings captured by the Department of Defense. They stood shackled before a deeply unforgiving, stern federal judge, and were quickly handed harsh mandatory consecutive prison sentences for aggravated wire fraud, extreme identity theft, and the direct malicious extortion of a decorated military official. They were entirely bankrupt, completely drained by mounting legal fees that ultimately proved utterly useless. The federal government enacted aggressive asset forfeiture protocols, stripping them of everything they had ever valued. The massive Beacon Hill estate was seized and auctioned off to satisfy the defaulted commercial loans they had fraudulently opened under my Social Security number. Their flashy luxury vehicles were forcefully towed away in the cold middle of the starless night. Their exclusive country club memberships were permanently and publicly revoked, cementing their absolute social exile. They painfully traded their beautiful designer evening gowns and perfectly tailored Italian suits for incredibly cheap standard-issue federal prison uniforms, permanently locked away in extremely bleak separate maximum security facilities, where their arrogant, entitled demands meant absolutely nothing to the apathetic prison guards. Brittany rapidly faced a remarkably swift, socially devastating, and utterly brutal public downfall. Her entire identity was intrinsically tied to the fraudulent wealth her parents had stolen. Once the federal indictments became public knowledge, her carefully curated social media empire completely collapsed. The audio recording of her gleefully mocking me and actively participating in the federal extortion plot was leaked to the press, rendering her instantly and permanently radioactive. Every single corporate sponsor severed ties with her overnight. The lucrative brand deals she had secured using the stolen capital vanished without a trace. Her millions of superficial followers violently and instantly turned against her, ruthlessly flooding her various comment sections with intense, highly publicized, overwhelmingly negative backlash. She tried to post tearful apology videos playing the victim, but the internet rejected her manufactured tears just as easily as I had rejected Patricia's. Stripped of her parents' stolen money and completely blacklisted by the influencer industry, Brittany was rapidly forced to declare personal bankruptcy. She lost her expensive downtown condominium and her leased sports car. She tragically ended up exactly where she had always secretly feared she would definitively be: entirely irrelevant, universally despised, and completely broke miserably, working a harsh minimum wage retail job every single day just to barely survive. My reckless brother Jason fared absolutely no better in the harsh aftermath. For his entire adult life, his reckless, highly destructive behavior had been shielded by Richard's deep pockets and Patricia's endless excuses. Without his parents there to constantly bail him out, bribe local judges, or hire elite defense attorneys, his actions finally caught up to him with devastating speed. Less than a month after the federal raid on the Beacon Hill estate, Jason was pulled over for yet another severe driving infraction. When he arrogantly demanded his one phone call from the holding cell, expecting his father's lawyers to secure his immediate release, he dialed a disconnected number. There was nobody left sitting at home to answer his desperate pleading calls. There was no secret overflowing trust fund left to drain. Jason was remanded to the county jail, forced to face the harsh, unmitigated reality of his own actions, without the safety net of stolen wealth to break his fall. While their entirely toxic, fraudulent empire rapidly burned to gray ashes, My own personal life greatly flourished with an absolutely unprecedented, beautifully vibrant clarity. The Department of Defense Inspector General had thoroughly reviewed the extensive evidence, completely exonerating me of any financial wrongdoing and permanently securing my top secret security clearance. I was formally and highly commended for my extremely precise, heavily tactical handling of the dangerous extortion threat. I proudly stood inside my massive new pristine office at the fortified naval base, quietly adjusting the crisp white collar of my uniform. I had been officially promoted and proudly granted full, absolute, unrestricted command of my cyber operations division. The heavy, deeply suffocating anxiety that had constantly plagued me for agonizing months was completely gone, beautifully replaced by a profound, unshakable sense of purpose, an ultimate professional vindication. The heavy wooden door slowly swung open, and David happily stepped into the spacious room, carefully holding two large steaming cups of incredibly hot, dark roast coffee. He instantly offered a wonderfully warm, highly genuine smile, completely and totally free of the tense, nervous energy that had constantly defined him during his disastrous engagement to my awful sister. David and I had formed a surprisingly close, resilient friendship in the turbulent aftermath of the Thanksgiving raid. He had completely dodged a massive life-altering bullet by escaping the toxic gravity of the Lawson family just before the federal indictments were unsealed. He confidently walked across the wide room and eagerly handed me a delicious coffee, his bright eyes rapidly scanning the impressive array of framed commendations lining my pristine office walls. "I see the new command suits you perfectly," David said, taking a sip from his cup. He leaned against the edge of my heavy oak desk, looking remarkably relaxed. "I just saw an article online about Brittany's latest failed attempt to launch a budget lifestyle blog. It got completely ratioed in the comments section within 10 minutes. I took a slow sip of my coffee, allowing a genuine, unburdened laugh to escape my chest. "It is almost tragic how predictable she is," I replied, shaking my head. "She spent her entire life believing that value was something you could buy with someone else's money. Now she is learning that respect actually has to be earned." David nodded in absolute agreement, a look of profound relief washing over his features. "I am just grateful I woke up when I did," he admitted, his voice dropping to a sincere, reflective tone. "If I had married into that family, they would have dragged me straight down to federal prison with them. You literally saved my life by exposing them." I smiled, feeling a deep, solid connection built on shared survival and undeniable truth. "We both successfully made it out alive, David. That specific fact is genuinely the only thing that truly matters right now." After David finally departed to happily return to his own highly successful civilian career, I walked out of my office and navigated the incredibly busy, bustling corridors of the massive command center. I calmly stepped out through the thick, heavy metal security doors and walked directly onto the massive, elevated exterior deck of the heavily fortified naval base. The late afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting brilliant streaks of vibrant orange and deep purple across the vast, endless expanse of the ocean horizon. The salty sea breeze whipped fiercely across my face, carrying the sharp, clean scent of the open water. I gripped the cold steel railing, staring out at the massive naval destroyers anchored in the deep harbor. I was completely surrounded by the highly disciplined, fiercely loyal men and women of my cyber operations team. They moved with purpose and dedication, executing their duties with a quiet, honorable dignity that my biological family could never possibly comprehend. For so many years, I had agonized over the fundamental lack of love and support from Richard and Patricia. I had desperately internalized their toxic criticisms, silently wondering why my absolute best was never quite good enough to earn their basic parental respect. I had allowed their greed to cast a dark, suffocating shadow over my incredible achievements. But as I proudly stood right there on the wide deck, entirely surrounded by the incredibly powerful, constantly relentless humming of absolute military readiness, I suddenly experienced a truly profound, staggeringly beautiful epiphany. I had absolutely not lost a family. You cannot lose something that never genuinely existed in the first place. I had simply cut off the heavy, rotting dead weight that was actively trying to drown me. Blood did not automatically grant someone the permanent right to exploit, manipulate, and destroy you. Blood was genuinely nothing more than a random, incredibly simple, completely meaningless biological coincidence. True family was something entirely different, completely separate from the shallow greed of the loss and legacy. True family was not forged in opulent ballrooms funded by stolen money or maintained through vicious emotional blackmail and constant manipulation. True family was actively forged in the trenches of real life. It was built on a solid, unbreakable foundation of mutual respect, absolute honor, and undeniable truth. My true family was the dedicated team of exceptional intelligence officers, constantly working tirelessly inside the command center behind me. My true family was the highly capable network of federal agents and tough prosecutors who had stood shoulder to shoulder with me to completely neutralize a malicious threat. My true family was fully comprised of the loyal friends and highly trusted allies like David, who valued integrity and character over superficial wealth and fabricated social status. I watched a massive naval carrier slowly chart its course toward the darkening horizon, its powerful engines churning the deep water into a trail of bright white foam. I was no longer the scapegoat of the Lawson family. I was no longer the financial safety net for a group of greedy, narcissistic criminals who viewed me as nothing more than an exploitable asset. I was a decorated military commander who had successfully orchestrated the total destruction of her greatest enemies, using nothing but the absolute, unwavering power of the truth. I took one final, incredibly deep breath of the crisp ocean air, feeling the immense, brilliant weight of my hard-earned freedom settling permanently into my bones. The dark, toxic past was completely and permanently obliterated, securely locked away inside barren federal prison cells where it absolutely and undoubtedly belonged. My bright, sprawling future was a vast, endlessly wide-open blue ocean, now completely clear of any hazardous, toxic obstructions, and I was finally truly and entirely in absolute command. The story of Rebecca and the Lawson family serves as a powerful reminder that sharing DNA does not automatically grant someone the right to your endless loyalty, especially when that loyalty is met with exploitation. For years, Rebecca was manipulated by the very people who were supposed to protect her. Her parents used the concept of family as a weapon to demand compliance, masking their profound greed behind the illusion of suburban perfection. The ultimate lesson here is that true family is not defined by bloodlines or toxic obligations. True family is built on a foundation of mutual respect, absolute honor, and undeniable truth. When Rebecca finally stopped seeking the approval of a family fundamentally incapable of giving it, she reclaimed her ultimate power. She didn't fight their emotional manipulation with tears or screaming. She fought it with cold, hard facts, strict boundaries, and unwavering accountability. By severing ties with the toxic weight of her biological relatives, Rebecca didn't lose a family. She simply made room to recognize her true one. She found her real family among those who stood by her in the trenches, the loyal allies who valued her integrity over superficial wealth. This narrative teaches us that we are never obligated to set ourselves on fire just to keep toxic people warm. We have the absolute right to walk away from environments that demand our destruction, and we have the power to choose who truly deserves a place in our lives. Have you ever had to draw a hard line and walk away from toxic relatives to protect your own peace? How did you find the courage to build your own chosen family? Share your stories of resilience and triumph in the comments below. If Rebecca's journey of taking back her power resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about overcoming betrayal and claiming the life you truly deserve.